The gate where starlight touched stone. We begin at dawn, when the world hovers between darkness and light, when shadows still cling to the earth like memories reluctant to fade. In the heart of ancient Babylon, there stood a gate, not merely a passage through walls, but a threshold between realms, a place where the earthly and the eternal touched. The Ishtar Gate, its name alone carries weight, heavy with the breath of centuries. Named for the goddess of love and war, of Venus rising in the evening sky, of contradictions held in divine balance. The gate rose 40 feet into the Mesopotamian heavens, a mountain of glazed brick that caught the morning sun and transformed it into something more than light, into revelation. It is said that the blue was like no other blue, not the pale wash of distant sky, but the deep infinite blue of lapis lazuli, brought from the mines of Afghanistan, ground into powder mixed with minerals and secrets, then glazed onto brick in a process that required fire and prayer in equal measure. The artisans who created this color understood something we have forgotten, that blue is the color of the divine, the shade of heaven reflected in earthly matter, the hue that exists in the space between day and night. Imagine, if you will, approaching this gate in the soft glow of early morning. The processional way stretches before you, paved with limestone that gleams like bone beneath your feet. On either side, walls rise, and on these walls, lions walk in endless parade, their bodies crafted from yellow and white glazed brick, their manes flowing like fire frozen in clay. 120 lions in total, guardians of the sacred path, their eyes forever fixed on the pilgrims who pass between them. But the gate itself, the gate is where wonder deepens into something else, something that touches the edges of the mystical. Upon its surface, creatures emerge from the blue, dragons with serpentine necks and scaled bodies, their feet resembling those of great cats, their heads crowned with horns. These are the Mushhushu, the sacred animals of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. Beside them stride the aurochs, mighty bulls with curved horns and powerful shoulders, animals consecrated to Adad, the storm god whose voice was thunder and whose tears were rain. These creatures never walked the earth. They existed in that borderland where imagination becomes theology, where dreams solidify into doctrine, where the impossible is granted life through belief and artistry. The craftsmen who shaped them worked from visions, from sacred texts, from descriptions passed down through generations of priests who claimed to have seen such beings in moments of divine revelation. Whispers tell us that the bricks themselves were sacred objects before they ever formed a wall. Each one was pressed into molds blessed by ritual, dried in the sun while prayers were chanted over them, fired in kilns where incense burned alongside the flames. The act of building the gate was not construction, it was ceremony. Every brick laid was an offering, every course completed was a hymn made manifest in clay and glaze. During the Akita festival, when the new year dawned and the world held its breath between the old cycle and the new, processions moved through this gate. Picture them, priests in robes of white linen, their heads shaven, their feet bare upon the sacred stones. Behind them, carried on platforms of cedar wood, came the statues of the gods Marduk in his glory, the scribe, Ishtar herself in her aspect as the morning star. The statues were wrapped in silk, dressed in garments woven with threads of gold, adorned with jewels that caught the light and threw it back in 1,000-colored fragments. The people followed, thousands upon thousands, their voices rising in chants that had been sung since time before memory, in a language that tasted of antiquity even then. They moved through the Ishtar Gate like water flowing through a sacred channel, and in that movement, something transformed. They entered as mortals, burdened by the weight of the profane year, and passed through into sanctity, into proximity with the divine. What did it feel like to walk beneath that arch? Beneath the silence of our modern world, we can almost hear it, the shuffle of countless feet, the murmur of prayer, the occasional cry of Marduk rising above the crowd. The air would have been thick with incense, myrrh and frankincense, cedar smoke, and the sweet scent of date wine poured out as libation. And overhead, the dragons watched with eyes that never blinked, that never judged, that simply held space for the sacred to occur. The gate stood for centuries, a testament to Nebuchadnezzar's devotion and his empire's reach. But empires are like sand castles built at the tide's edge, magnificent for a moment, then gradually erased by the relentless flow of time. The gate fell silent. The procession ceased. The language in which the prayers were chanted faded from human tongues, became a dead thing, a puzzle written in wedge-shaped marks that no one could decipher. The city crumbled, was buried, became a legend told in whispers, a name invoked in prophecy and cautionary tale. For 2,000 years, the Ishtar Gate slept beneath the desert. When archaeologists finally uncovered it in the early 20th century, they found it in pieces, a shattered mosaic of blue and gold, scattered across the sand like stars that had fallen to earth and broken. They mapped the fragments, photographed them, carefully excavated each piece, and numbered it, catalogued it, tried to reconstruct the whole from the scattered parts. Some of those pieces now stand in museums, reassembled into a version of the gate, an echo of its former self. In Berlin, behind climate-controlled glass, you can see a reconstruction smaller than the original, incomplete, but still breathtaking in its cobalt magnificence. Visitors stand before it and take photographs, marvel at the craftsmanship, read the plaques that explain the history, the culture, the archaeological significance. But something is missing. You cannot hear the prayers. You cannot smell the incense. You cannot feel the crush of the crowd around you, the collective breath held as the gods pass through, the sense that in this moment, the veil between worlds had grown thin enough to see through, if only you looked with the right kind of eyes. The reconstructed gate is a body without a soul, beautiful, yes, instructive, certainly, but empty of the living presence that once animated it. Perhaps that is the nature of all thresholds. They exist not in the physical structure, but in the intention of those who pass through them. A gate is only a gate when someone crosses it believing they are moving from one state of being to another. Without that belief, it is merely an arrangement of bricks and mortar, however beautifully glazed. Marked by the moon, touched by starlight, the Ishtar Gate stands now in two places: in the reconstructed halls of distant museums, and in the realm of memory, where it remains forever perfect, forever whole, forever alive with the echo of ancient feet and ancient prayers. As we sit in the gathering twilight of our own day, we might ask ourselves, what gates do we pass through? What thresholds do we cross without noticing? Are there moments in our lives when the ordinary becomes luminous, when the profane touches the sacred, when we move through a space that is more than mere space? It is said that every doorway is an Ishtar Gate, if we have the eyes to see it. Every passage from one room to another is an opportunity for transformation, for leaving behind what no longer serves us and stepping into what might be. The dragons and bulls need not be carved in ceramic. They exist in the vigilance of our own awareness, guardians of the thresholds we create with every conscious choice. Where memory fades into silence, where the last echo of the last prayer dissolves into desert wind, the gate remains not as monument, but as question. It asks us, what is sacred? What is worth preserving? What beauty might we create if we approached our work as ritual, our buildings as temples, our ordinary days as processions toward something greater than ourselves? The stars still turn overhead, as they did when the gate was new. The same constellations that the Babylonian priests charted still wheel through their eternal dance. And somewhere in the space between what was and what might be, the Ishtar Gate stands perfect and eternal, waiting for pilgrims who will never come, guarding a threshold that leads everywhere and nowhere, holding open a passage between the worlds. Perhaps it was never meant to be fully reconstructed. Perhaps some things are more powerful as fragments, as memories, as questions without answers. Perhaps the sacred exists not in the object itself, but in our longing for it, our reaching toward it, our willingness to believe that beauty and meaning and transcendence are possible, is then in a world of dust and ruin and forgetting. The gate stands. The gate has fallen. Both are true. Both will always be true. And in the silence that follows, we are left with the blue, that impossible eternal blue glowing in the chambers of memory, a color that means heaven, that means mystery, that means the space where starlight touches stone, and everything for just a moment becomes holy. The gardens that vanished into legend, did they ever bloom? This is the question that hovers over Babylon like morning mist over water, like a fragrance that reaches us from some distant place we cannot name. The hanging gardens spoken of in whispers, written of in wonder, searched for in sand and silence drift through history, quite real or entirely imagined, suspended in that strange country where longing becomes architecture, where desire takes root and grows. It is said that they were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Yet alone among those marvels, the hanging gardens leave no certain trace, no foundation stone, no inscription, no archaeological evidence that rises above the realm of debate and conjecture. They exist in words only, in the accounts of ancient travelers who claim to have seen them, in the poetry of those who heard the stories and passed them on, in the collective memory of a civilization that needed to believe such beauty was possible. Strabo the geographer wrote of them in the 1st century, though he himself had never walked their pathways. He described vaulted stone chambers, terraces rising one above another, arches supporting the weight of earth and tree and waterway. Philo of Byzantium spoke of gardens that seemed to float in air, their plants cultivated at such heights that those who stood beneath could look up and see roots hanging down like the beards of ancient prophets. Diodorus Siculus told of a square garden, each side 400 feet in length, ascending in tiers, like a theater built for gods rather than men. He wrote of the thickness of walls necessary to support such weight of the sheets of lead and reed, laid down to prevent water from seeping through and weakening the structure of soil deep enough that the largest trees could send down roots and stand against the wind. But these writers lived centuries after the garden's supposed creation. None had seen them with their own eyes. They wrote what they had been told, what they had read in texts now lost to us, what they imagined based on rumor and reputation, and the human hunger for wonder. Where memory fades, story begins. The most persistent tale speaks of love, or perhaps of homesickness, which is love's melancholy cousin. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, married a Midas of Media, a princess from the mountain country to the north. She came to his city of brick and dust, to his empire of flatlands stretching endlessly beneath an unforgiving sun, and she mourned. The story tells us she grew pale, grew silent, stood on the palace rooftop, and gazed northward toward mountains she could no longer see. And Nebuchadnezzar, moved by her sorrow, commanded that mountains be built, that green terraces rise from the desert floor, that water be brought up from the Euphrates through mechanisms hidden and mysterious, so his queen might walk among gardens that reminded her of home, might hear the sound of falling water, might smell pine and cedar and flowering almond, might feel for just a moment as though she had not been exiled from everything she knew. It is a beautiful story, perhaps too beautiful, perhaps the kind of story that grows in the absence of truth, filling the empty space with narrative as vines fill a trellis. Some scholars now believe the gardens existed elsewhere, in Nineveh rather than Babylon, built by a different king in a different century. Others suggest they were purely mythical, a fantasy born from Babylon's reputation for magnificence, from the human need to imagine paradise made manifest, from travelers' tales grown more elaborate with each retelling. But let us, for a moment, imagine them real. Picture it, dawn in Babylon, and the gardens waking with the light. The lowest terrace is a forest of date palms, their fronds rustling in the morning breeze, their shadows long across pathways paved with stones brought from distant quarries. Here grow the fruit trees pomegranate and fig, almond and olive, their branches heavy with abundance, their leaves catching drops of water from the irrigation channels that run like veins throughout the structure. Ascending to the second terrace, the trees give way to flowering shrubs, roses in shades of pink and red and white, their scent rising like prayer, like the smoke of sacred offerings. Jasmine climbs wooden frames, its star-shaped blossoms opening to release perfume that makes the air itself seem sacred. Lilies stand in clusters, their throats deep and golden, visited by bees that have traveled from hives kept specifically for the garden's pollination. Higher still, the third terrace is given over to herbs and smaller plants, mint and thyme, coriander and cumin, healing plants whose names we've lost, whose properties died with the physicians who cultivated them. The soil here is rich and dark, nothing like the pale dust of the surrounding desert. It was brought in, some say, from the mountains themselves, carried by donkey and cart, thousands of loads over many years, so the plants of the high country might find familiar earth in which to root. And at the very top, the fourth terrace, the summit of this man-made mountain, there stood a pavilion. Columns of cedar supported a roof tiled in blue-glazed ceramic, creating shade where the queen could sit and look out over her adopted city, over the Euphrates flowing like liquid copper in the afternoon sun, over the ziggurats and temples and markets, over everything Nebuchadnezzar commanded. Yet when she closed her eyes, the story tells us she could pretend she was home. The sound of water in the channels became mountain streams, the scent of pine became the forests of Media, and for a moment exile felt less absolute. But how did the water reach such heights? Beneath the silence of scholarly uncertainty, theories bloom like the gardens themselves. Some suggest a chain pump system, buckets attached to a continuous loop of rope or chain, turned by oxen or slaves walking in endless circles, lifting water from the river to the first terrace, then from the first to the second, and so on. Others propose a screw pump, a spiral device turned by hand or animal power, forcing water upward through its coiled interior. The engineering would have been extraordinary, the labor required immense, the cost staggering, and the maintenance constant. This was not a garden that could be planted and left to grow. It required daily attention, hourly vigilance. One break in the water system and entire sections would wither. One season of neglect and the desert would reclaim what had been so laboriously wrested from it. Perhaps that is why no trace remains. Perhaps the gardens required such intensive upkeep that when the empire fell, when the resources and labor were no longer available, they died quickly. Plants became dust. Wooden structures rotted. Stone was repurposed for other buildings. Within a generation or two, nothing remained but memory. Within a few centuries, even the memory grew uncertain. Marked by the moon, touched by absence, the hanging gardens exist now in that peculiar space reserved for things that might have been. They keep company with Atlantis and Shangri-La, with El Dorado and Avalon, places that live more vividly in imagination than they ever could in excavated stone. And perhaps that is exactly where they belong. Every culture, in every age, has dreamed of paradise. The Garden of Eden, where innocence walked beneath trees that bore fruit without toil. The Elysian fields, where heroes rested in eternal spring. The pure land of the East, where lotus blossoms opened on waters of perfect clarity. These gardens are not places we can visit, but destinations of the spirit, landscapes of longing. The hanging gardens of Babylon, real or imagined, speak to something fundamental in the human heart, the desire to create beauty, to overcome limitation, to raise green life from barren earth, to build heaven in the midst of exile. We are all, in some sense, amidst displaced, homesick, yearning for a landscape we can barely remember. And we are all Nebuchadnezzar, attempting to build with our own hands what we cannot otherwise possess, trying to reconstruct from memory and desire a paradise we fear we've lost. In forgotten corners of the earth, archaeologists still search. They dig through layers of sand and shattered brick. They study ancient texts, compare accounts, argue over translations and interpretations. They employ ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery, seeking any anomaly that might suggest, here is where the gardens grew. But perhaps the search itself is the point. Perhaps we need the hanging gardens to remain elusive, to hover forever just beyond proof, to exist in that liminal space where history becomes myth, and myth becomes something more true than mere fact. Some believe that the gardens bloom still, in the realm where all lost things gather, where all abandoned dreams take root. In that place between memory and imagination, the terraces rise green and living, water flows upward as though gravity had relented, and a queen walks paths lined with roses, finally at peace. Where the desert wind carries whispers of leaves that may never have rustled, where the air holds traces of perfume from flowers that may never have bloomed, the hanging gardens remain neither proven nor disproven, neither here nor gone, but suspended in eternal perhaps. And in the soft darkness of our contemplation, we understand that all gardens are hanging gardens. All beauty is suspended between earth and heaven. All paradise is half remembered, half imagined. All green growth is a kind of miracle water coaxed upward, life summoned from dust, order carved from chaos by care and devotion and impossible hope. Maybe they were real, maybe they were dream, maybe there is no difference in the end between a garden that bloomed in Babylon 25 centuries ago and a garden that blooms now. In the telling of it, in the yearning for it, in our persistent belief that such beauty could exist. Maybe memory is the soil where impossible flowers grow, and maybe that is enough. The tower where language shattered. Before the scattering, there was unity, or so the story tells us. A time when all humanity spoke with one voice, when words flowed like water from mouth to ear, without impediment, without confusion, without the terrible gap that opens between what is meant and what is understood. In that ancient moment, whether real or imagined, whether history or parable, language was a bridge that connected every soul to every other, and the world was, in some essential way, whole. Then came the tower. It rises in our contemplation not as brick and mortar alone, but as symbol, as warning, as the place where something fundamental broke. The Tower of Babel, its name now synonymous with confusion, with the chaos of incomprehension, with the moment when unity fractured into 10,000 fragments and scattered across the earth like seeds on the wind. Whispers tell us it stood in Babylon, that ancient city of wonders and contradictions. Archaeologists believe they have found its echo in the ruins of Etem-Ananke, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, a ziggurat that once dominated the city's skyline, that drew the eye upward, that seemed to pin the earth to the sky like a great axis around which the world turned. 7 tiers it climbed, each one smaller than the one below. Each one painted a different sacred color. At the base, black, the color of the underworld, of the rich soil that grew barley and sustained life, of darkness from which all things emerge. Above it, white, purity, bone, the bleached light of revelation. Then red, blood and sacrifice, the color of life given and taken. Blue came next, heaven's own shade, the color between human and divine. Then silver, moonlight made solid, the metal of reflection and memory. Above that, gold, sunlight captured, the substance of divinity, the flesh of gods. And finally, at the summit, a shrine to Marduk clothed in colors we can only guess at, a chamber where heaven and earth were meant to meet. Imagine climbing it, as priests once did in the cool hours before dawn. Your feet find the first step, worn smooth by centuries of sacred ascent. You begin in the realm of black, in the shadow world, and with each tier you rise, the city below grows smaller, more distant, more like a memory than a place. Your breath comes harder as the air thins. Your legs ache with the effort, but still you climb, because something calls from above, whether God or ambition, whether devotion or pride, you cannot say. By the time you reach the blue tier, you are higher than the palm trees, higher than the date harvests, higher than the smoke from cooking fires. The Euphrates is a ribbon of copper threading through the landscape. The walls of Babylon are toy blocks scattered by a child's hand. You are leaving the human world behind, entering the realm of eagles and clouds, and whatever powers govern the spaces between earth and stars. It is said that the tower was built in the days when all people spoke the same language, when communication was effortless, when a worker from the north and a worker from the south could share plans and jokes and songs without the barrier of different tongues. United in language, they were united in purpose, to build a tower that reached heaven, to make a name for themselves, to create something that would outlast them, that would touch eternity. The biblical account is brief, almost stark in its simplicity. The people said to one another, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower with its top in the heavens." And they began. Brick by brick, tier by tier, the structure rose, until God looked down and saw what they were doing, saw their unity and their ambition, and said something that echoes through the centuries with troubling resonance. Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. And so God confused their language, scattered their speech, made it so the bricklayer could no longer understand the architect could no longer communicate with the laborer could no longer share understanding with the one working beside him. In an instant or perhaps gradually, as confusion spread like contagion through the workforce, the tower became a place of babble, of sounds without sense. Work stopped. The tower stood unfinished. The people scattered across the earth, each group carrying with them their newly incomprehensible tongue, and language. That fundamental tool of human connection became also a wall, a boundary, a source of separation. But was it punishment or protection? Beneath the silence of theological debate, we might consider this. What were they building, really? Was the tower an act of worship or an act of war? Were they reaching toward God or attempting to storm heaven? The text says they wanted to make a name for themselves, which suggests pride, ego, the human hunger to be remembered. But it also says they wanted to avoid being dispersed over the face of the whole earth, which suggests fear, the terror of separation, of being alone in the vastness. Perhaps the tower was both prayer and defiance. Perhaps all great architecture is. We know from Babylonian texts that Etemenanke was considered a sacred link between realms, a place where the gods could descend to earth, and humans could ascend toward divinity. Kings restored it, generation after generation. Nebuchadnezzar himself worked on it, boasting in inscriptions of how he raised high the top of the tower. It was a temple, yes, but also a cosmic mountain, a replica in brick of the primordial hill that emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of creation. So when the biblical writers described a tower built to reach heaven, they were drawing on something real, the actual experience of seeing these massive ziggurats rising from the Mesopotamian plain, structures so tall that clouds sometimes wreathed their summits, so imposing that they seemed to violate the natural order, to claim space in the realm reserved for birds and wind and the breath of gods. What would make such a tower fall? Structural instability, perhaps. Ziggurats required constant maintenance. The bricks were made of clay and straw, bound together with bitumen materials that weathered, that cracked, that crumbled. Neglect for even a few decades could cause significant damage. Add to that the possibility of earthquake. Mesopotamia sits on a seismically active zone, and the tower's collapse becomes not divine intervention, but geological inevitability. Or perhaps it never collapsed at all. Perhaps it simply stood abandoned. Work stopped not by the confusion of languages, but by the exhaustion of resources, the death of a king, the shift of political priorities. The tower remains, incomplete and silent, while the workers drift away to other projects, other cities, other lives. But the metaphor of linguistic confusion that rings true in a way that transcends literal history. Because Babylon was, in fact, a city of many languages. It sat at the crossroads of trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, that linked Egypt to India, that brought together merchants and slave soldiers and scholars, people who spoke Akkadian and Aramaic, Sumerian and Elamite, Egyptian and Greek. In Babylon's markets, you could hear a dozen tongues in as many minutes. The confusion of Babel was not a single catastrophic event, but a daily reality, the challenge of commerce and governance and simple human connection in a multilingual world. So perhaps the story is not about a moment when language shattered, but about the ongoing experience of linguistic diversity, of the difficulty of understanding and being understood, of the way communication, that seemingly simple act, is actually fraught with complexity and potential for misunderstanding. Where memory fades into myth, we find this truth. Language separates us, but language also defines us. Each tongue carries within it an entire worldview, a way of parsing reality, a unique architecture of thought. When we lost the single language, if ever there was such a thing, we gained thousands of ways to see the world, thousands of poetic traditions, thousands of ways to name the stars and the sorrows and the sacred. Was it punishment or gift? The tower stands or stood as a monument to both, to the ambition that drives us to reach beyond our grasp, to the diversity that enriches us even as it divides us, to the fundamental loneliness of being human, trapped in our individual skulls, able to send signals across the gap, but never quite certain they'll be received as we intended. Marked by the moon, touched by time, the Tower of Babel exists now in that borderland between history and parable. Etemenanke crumbled long ago, its bricks scattered, its colors faded, its shrine to Marduk empty of offerings and prayers. Alexander the Great considered rebuilding it, we're told, but died before the work could begin. After that, it fell into ruin, was quarried for building materials, was gradually buried beneath sand and the sediment of flooding rivers. But the story persists. It appears in Genesis, in the Quran, in rabbinic commentary and Christian theology. It echoes in paintings and poems, in political speeches about unity and division, in linguistic studies that trace how languages branch and diverge from common ancestors. The tower stands in human imagination as powerfully as it ever stood on the Mesopotamian plain, and perhaps that persistence is itself a form of reconciliation, because here we are, thousands of years later, speaking different tongues, scattered across the earth, exactly as the story describes. Yet we still tell the same stories. We still reach toward the same stars. We still build towers of steel and glass now, rather than brick and bitumen, but towers nonetheless that express our refusal to accept limitation, our determination to rise higher, to see farther, to touch something beyond the merely human. We are fractured, and we are whole. We are many, and we are one. We speak 10,000 languages, and yet, somehow, we understand each other. Not perfectly, not without effort, but enough. Enough to trade and travel and translate. Enough to share songs across borders. Enough to recognize in a stranger's eyes the same fears and hopes that move in our own hearts. The tower crumbled, but we remain. Builders still, strivers still, reaching upward still. Even knowing that heaven cannot be stormed, that the sacred remains sacred precisely because it exceeds our grasp. In the soft darkness where day dissolves into night, where words fade into the silence that holds all languages equally, the tower stands eternal, neither risen nor fallen, but suspended in the moment between ambition and achievement, between unity and division, between the words we speak and the meaning we intend. Perhaps it was never meant to be completed. Perhaps some towers are more perfect as fragments, as questions, as invitations to keep climbing, even knowing we'll never reach the top. The stars still turn overhead, indifferent to our babbling, and in that indifference, strangely, there is comfort that we are small enough to be humble, but bold enough to build anyway. The tablets written in wedges of starlight. In the beginning, there was clay, soft and yielding, drawn from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers that carried within their waters the memory of mountains dissolved, of ancient rains, of time itself flowing slowly toward the sea. The Sumerians and Babylonians who lived between these rivers understood that clay was more than mere earth, it was possibility, it was the substance from which worlds could be shaped. And so they pressed meaning into it. Cuneiform, the word itself, comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. But before there were Latin scholars naming ancient scripts, there were reeds cut from riverbanks, their ends trimmed to precise angles, held in hands that had learned through years of training exactly how much pressure to apply exactly what angle would create clarity rather than confusion. It is said that writing emerged from accounting, from the prosaic need to track grain and livestock, to record who owed what to whom, to make permanent what memory might lose. The earliest tablets are inventories. So many jars of oil, so many sheep, so many measures of barley. But even in these mundane records, something miraculous was happening. Thought was becoming object, voice was becoming visible, time was being captured and held. Imagine holding one of these tablets in your hand, not in a museum, behind glass and interpretive placards, but newly made, still slightly damp, the impressions fresh and crisp. It fits easily in your palm, no larger than your hand spread wide. Its surface is covered with marks that look, at first glance, like the tracks of birds in mud, angular, precise, mysterious. But look closer. Each mark is deliberate. Each wedge has meaning. Together, they form words, sentences, complete thoughts transmitted across the gap between one mind and another. The scribe who made this tablet sat in a scriptorium, perhaps in a temple complex, perhaps in a palace archive, and pressed into clay what someone else needed preserved. A contract for the sale of a house, a letter from a merchant to his trading partner, a prayer to Shamash, the sun god, asking for justice in a legal dispute. Or perhaps, and this is where the mundane transforms into the sacred, a map of the heavens. Whispers tell us that Babylonian astronomers were among the finest observers of celestial phenomena the ancient world produced. They did not have telescopes. They had only their eyes, their patience, and their tablets. Night after night, they stood on temple roofs, on ziggurat platforms, in open courtyards, watching the sky with an attention we can barely imagine in our electrically lit world, where stars are suggestions rather than revelations. They tracked Venus with particular devotion. The evening star, the morning star sacred to Ishtar, goddess of love and war, of contradictions held in divine balance. They noted when she rose and where, when she set and into what constellation. They discovered her cycle, 584 days from one heliacal rising to the next. They recorded these observations on tablets, creating astronomical diaries that span decades, centuries, millennia. The Enuma Anu Enlil was their great work, a compendium of omens derived from celestial observations, 70 tablets containing 7,000 omens, each one linking a heavenly event to an earthly consequence. If Mars approaches the Pleiades, war will come. If the moon is eclipsed on such and such a day, the king will face rebellion. If Venus appears in a certain house of the zodiac, the harvest will be abundant. We might dismiss this as superstition, as the error of confusing correlation with causation. But beneath the silence of our modern skepticism, we might also recognize something profound: the belief that patterns exist, that the universe is not random chaos, but ordered cosmos. That observation and record-keeping can reveal hidden structures, that the future is not entirely opaque to those who watch carefully enough. They divided the zodiac into 12 equal sections, giving us Aries, Taurus, Gemini, names we still use, though translated through Greek and Latin from their Akkadian originals. They measured the lunar month with precision that would not be improved upon for thousands of years. They predicted eclipses, not perfectly, but remarkably well for people working without instruments beyond the naked eye and the tablet in their hands. And all of this accumulated wisdom, this patient observation spanning generations, was preserved in wedges pressed into clay. The scribes who created these tablets were the intellectual elite of their civilization. Training began in childhood. In the Aduba, the tablet house, the school, young students copied signs over and over, learning first simple characters, then progressing to complex combinations, then to full texts. They memorized lists of trees, of stones, of stars, of professions, of gods. Lists were the backbone of learning, the way knowledge was organized and transmitted. Errors were corrected by smoothing the clay and starting again. The tablet was forgiving in a way that later writing surfaces, papyrus, parchment, paper would not be. A mistake could be erased, reworked, perfected before the clay was fired, and the text made permanent. But once fired, once transformed by heat from soft earth into ceramic, the tablet became nearly indestructible. Fire that would consume papyrus only hardened clay. Water that would dissolve ink only required the tablet to be dried again. Time itself seemed to pass over these objects with unusual gentleness. Buried in the ruins of libraries and archives, protected by the very destruction that buried them, they waited. Marked by the moon, touched by the hands of those long dead, the tablets accumulated. Tens of thousands of them, hundreds of thousands. Libraries filled with them. The library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh held perhaps 30,000 tablets before the city fell. When the palace burned, the tablets were baked harder, preserved by the very catastrophe that destroyed everything around them. What did they contain, these thousands upon thousands of tablets? Everything human. Administrative records, yes, receipts and contracts, tax assessments and inventory lists, but also literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's first great story, pressed into clay 3,000 years before Homer. Mathematical texts teaching geometry and algebra, medical prescriptions, legal codes, letters between friends, between family members separated by distance and war and time, love poems written by a husband to his wife. You have captivated me. Let me stand trembling before you. Complaints from a son to his father. Why do you not teach me your craft? Prayers crying out to gods who seemed distant. How long, O my lady, will you be angry with me? In forgotten corners of ancient archives, there are tablets no one has yet read. Languages we haven't fully deciphered. Sumerian gave way to Akkadian, which branched into Babylonian and Assyrian, which eventually died as Aramaic became the lingua franca of the Near East. The last cuneiform texts were written in the 1st century of the Common Era. Astronomical observations, fittingly, recorded by priests who were among the last people on earth, who could still read and write the ancient script. Then silence, long and deep. The ability to read cuneiform died. The tablets remained, but they became mute objects rather than texts, curiosities rather than voices. For nearly 2,000 years, they spoke to no one, until the 19th century, when scholars began the painstaking work of decipherment. The Behistun inscription provided the key, a text in 3 languages, including Old Persian and Akkadian, carved on a cliff face in what is now Iran. Henry Rawlinson risked his life copying it, dangling from ropes on the rock face, making impressions of the cuneiform characters. And slowly, character by character, the language began to yield its secrets. The tablets began to speak again. Imagine what that must have been like to hold a tablet that had been silent for 2 millennia and suddenly understand it. To read a letter written by someone who lived 3,000 years ago and feel the same frustrations, the same joys, the same ordinary humanness reaching across that gulf of time. Writing was magic, is magic. The first technology that conquered death. A scribe in ancient Babylon could press words into clay, and those words could outlast his body, his children, his city, his civilization. They could wait in the earth, patient and silent, until someone came who could wake them. Where memory fades, the tablets remember. Where voices fall silent, the wedges speak. In the cuneiform archives of the world's museums, millions of tablets wait, many still unread and studied, untranslated. There are not enough scholars, not enough time, not enough resources to read them all. They hold within them stories we don't yet know, observations that might change how we understand the ancient world, voices that have been silent too long. Perhaps somewhere in those unread tablets is a poem more beautiful than any we know, a scientific observation that would astonish us, a letter that would break our hearts, a name that deserves to be remembered. Or perhaps there are only more lists, more contracts, more mundane records of mundane lives. But even those matter. Even those speak to us of what it meant to be human, to live and work and worry about barley harvests and debt payments and whether your son was learning his trade properly. In the soft dark of evening, as the light fades and the stars emerge, we might imagine the last tablet written in Babylon. Not the actual last one, we don't know which that was, but a last one. Imagine a scribe in a nearly empty scriptorium, the old ways dying around him, the language fewer and fewer people speak. He presses words into clay with practiced movements, decades of training in every angle of the stylus. Perhaps he's copying an old text, preserving something he fears will be lost. Perhaps he's recording the stars, Venus rising in the east, a partial eclipse of the moon, the way Mars stands near Jupiter in the constellation we call Leo. He finishes, smooths one final error, checks his work. The tablet is complete. He sets it aside to dry, files it in the archive with thousands of others. Then he goes home, eats dinner with his family, sleeps, wakes to another day. He doesn't know he's among the last. Doesn't know that within a generation or two, no one will be able to read what he's written. The tradition will die, not dramatically but gradually, like a candle guttering out, like a voice fading into the distance. But the tablets remain, waiting in the dark, waiting in the earth, waiting for someone to learn again the language of wedges, the grammar of clay, the art of listening to voices that have been speaking all along. If only we could hear them. Beneath the silence, they whisper still. The tablets written in wedges of starlight, preserving the heavens and the earth, the sacred and the mundane, the voices of those who understood that some things, some precious things must be pressed into permanent form before time washes them away. And perhaps that is the gift they offer us across the centuries. The reminder that we too are scribes pressing meaning into whatever medium we have, hoping someone in the future will understand, will remember, will know that we were here, that we watched the stars and loved and worried and hoped and tried in our small way to speak across the darkness into whatever comes after. The river that remembered everything. There is a river that has seen empires rise like morning mist and dissolve like evening shadow. A river older than memory, older than the cities built upon its banks, older than the names humans gave to gods. The Euphrates, even its name is ancient, derived from words that mean the good river, the sweet water, the life giver, in a land where life was always a negotiation with thirst. It flows through Babylon like a vein of living memory, carrying within its current not only water drawn from distant mountains, but time itself, fluid, inexorable, forever moving toward the sea. We begin at its source, though source is perhaps the wrong word for something so ancient. High in the mountains of eastern Turkey, where snow gathers in the cold months and releases in the warmth of spring, the Euphrates is born from 1,000 small tributaries, from snowmelt and rain, from the slow accumulation of water finding its inevitable path downward, always downward, pulled by gravity toward the Persian Gulf more than 1,700 miles away. By the time it reaches the plains of Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, it has become something more than water. It has become possibility. In a landscape where rain is scarce and irregular, where the sun burns with relentless intensity, the river is the difference between life and death, between cultivation and wilderness, between civilization and dust. It is said that the Babylonians understood this in their bones, in the very structure of their civilization. The river was not merely a resource to be exploited. It was a sacred presence, a manifestation of the divine moving through the world. He called Enki by the Sumerians who came before was the god of fresh water, of wisdom, of the deep. He dwelt in the Apsu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth, and the rivers were his gift, his blessing flowing up from those hidden depths to sustain all life. Each spring, the snowmelt arrived, slowly at first, then with increasing volume, the river swelled. Its color changed from the deep blue-green of low water to the muddy brown of flooding, thick with sediment carried from the mountains, minerals and nutrients that would, when the water receded, leave behind the rich soil in which barley and wheat could grow, in which date palms could sink their roots and rise toward the sun. But this flooding was unpredictable. Unlike the Nile, which flooded with calendar regularity, the Euphrates and Tigris were capricious. Some years the flood came early, some years late. Some years it was gentle, spreading slowly across the fields. Other years it was catastrophic, tearing away embankments, drowning villages, destroying months of work in hours of unleashed power. And so the Babylonians learned to negotiate with the river. They built canals to direct its flow. They constructed levees to contain its floods. They dug irrigation channels to carry water to fields that would otherwise remain barren. The maintenance of these waterworks was not optional, it was the foundation of everything. Kings boasted in their inscriptions not only of military victories, but of canals dredged, of embankments strengthened, of water brought to places that had known only thirst. Whispers tell us that the river divided Babylon into two parts: the old city on the east bank, the new city on the west. Grand bridges spanned its width, allowing the processional way to continue unbroken, pilgrims crossing from one shore to the other during the sacred festivals. Imagine walking that bridge during the Akita celebration, the river flowing beneath your feet, ancient and indifferent, the city rising on both sides, its walls and temples and gardens, the weight of the divine presence being carried before you, the statue of Marduk wrapped in silk and mystery, moving across moving water toward the temple that awaited. There was symbolism in this crossing. Water was always symbolic. Water was threshold, boundary, the line between states of being. To cross water was to undergo transformation, to leave behind what was and enter what would be. Baptism, purification, earth. Every culture that lived near water understood this. The Babylonians performed rituals on the riverbanks. Bodies were bathed in purification ceremonies, the river's water washing away not only physical dirt but spiritual contamination. the accumulation of minor transgressions and bad luck that clung to a person like dust. Vows were spoken over the river's surface, the current carrying the words away, taking them to the gods, making them irrevocable. Offerings were dropped into the depths, small clay figurines, written prayers sealed in ceramic containers, occasionally something more valuable, a piece of jewelry, a bronze tool, a sacrifice given to the water in exchange for favor, for protection, for safe passage. What lies at the bottom of the Euphrates? What accumulated in its mud over the millennia of Babylon's existence? How many prayers rest in the silt? How many secrets does the river keep, patient and silent? Herodotus, that curious Greek who traveled through the Near East in the 5th century BC, wrote descriptions of Babylon that border on the fantastical. He claimed the city walls descended into the river's bed, creating an underwater barrier so complete that no enemy could swim up the current and enter the city from beneath. Whether this was true or merely travelers' embellishment, we cannot know, but it speaks to the importance of the river in Babylonese defensive thinking. It was highway and moat both, trade route and boundary, blessing and threat. Beneath the silence of modern scholarship, we know this much for certain. The river that flows through the ruins of Babylon today is not the same river that flowed through the living city. Rivers are not static. They move not only forward but sideways, gradually shifting their courses over decades and centuries. The Euphrates has meandered across the Mesopotamian plain, abandoning old channels and carving new ones, responding to floods and droughts, to earthquakes and human intervention, to the slow accumulation of sediment that raises the riverbed until the water seeks an easier path. Where Babylon once commanded both banks, the river now flows at a distance. Ancient bridges span channels that are dry. Harbor facilities built to receive boats laden with goods from the Persian Gulf now stand stranded, landlocked, their stone stairs descending into nothing but air and memory. Archaeologists excavate in places where water once moved. They dig through layers of silt and find the foundations of buildings that once stood at the river's edge, docks and warehouses, temples where priests performed dawn rituals with river water carried up in ceremonial vessels, homes where families listen each night to the sound of the current moving past their walls. These foundations tell stories of their own. The stones at water level are worn smooth, polished by centuries of flow. In some places, wooden pilings remain, cedar brought from Lebanon, resistant to rot, driven deep into the riverbed to support structures built half on land, half on water. In excavating these pilings, in studying the wear patterns on the stones, archaeologists reconstruct not only what stood here, but how the river behaved, how high it rose in flood season, how low it fell during drought. Marked by the moon, touched by time, the river continues. It flows past the ruins without noticing them. It carries the same sediment. It always has particles of mountain slowly being delivered to the sea, the eternal work of water wearing down stone of high places, gradually becoming low places of the earth, perpetually reshaping itself at speeds too slow for human lifetimes to perceive, but rapid in geological time. If rivers could speak, what would the Euphrates say? Would it remember the first humans who settled on its banks, building reed huts and planting the wild ancestors of wheat? Would it recall the Sumerians who developed cuneiform and the wheel, who built the first cities? Would it speak of the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Arabs, all the peoples who came and went, who built and destroyed, who depended utterly on the water's blessing? Or would it remember nothing? Rivers have no memory in the way humans do. They do not accumulate experience, do not learn from the past, do not anticipate the future. They simply flow, following the path of least resistance, responding to the gradient of the land and the volume of water they carry. They are pure present tense, pure ongoing action, pure flow. And yet, the sediment remembers. Layered in the riverbed, in the floodplains, in the deltaic deposits where the Euphrates meets the sea, is a record as detailed as any written in cuneiform on clay tablets. Each layer tells of a particular moment, a particular year's flood, a particular season's drought. Pollen grains preserved in the mud speak of what plants grew when. Traces of human presence, pottery shards, metal fragments, Charcoal from fires marked the locations and times of settlement. In forgotten corners where the ancient channel can still be traced, archaeologists extract cores from the sediment. Long tubes driven deep into the earth, then carefully removed, preserving the layers in sequence. In laboratories, these cores are analyzed centimeter by centimeter. The story they tell is not one of events and personalities, not one of kings and conquests, but one of climate and ecology, of changing water levels and shifting agriculture, of the slow environmental transformations that shape the possibilities for human civilization. The river remembers in sediment what humans recorded in story. Both are archives. Both preserve what would otherwise be lost. Where memory fades, the river persists. It flowed before Babylon was built. It will flow after the last brick has crumbled into dust and blown away. It connects the present to the deep past in a way that is almost vertiginous to contemplate, that the water molecule touching your hand might once have been drawn up by a cedar tree in ancient Lebanon, might have fallen as rain on Nebuchadnezzar's hanging gardens, might have been drunk by a scribe copying tablets in Hammurabi's time, might have carried a boat bearing tribute from the Persian Gulf. All water is ancient. All water has been everywhere, cycling endlessly through ocean and cloud, rain and river, plant and animal, ice and vapor. The Euphrates you could visit today contains within it the Euphrates of Babylon, and of yore before that, and of the first human settlements before written history began. Perhaps that is what we mean when we speak of the river remembering. Not that it possesses consciousness or intention, but that it is continuity itself, the thread that connects all the moments, all the generations, all the civilizations that rose and fell on its banks. In the soft dark of evening, as starlight begins to reflect on the river's surface, the same stars the Babylonian astronomers charted, the same constellations they named, we might sit on the bank and listen. Not for words, but for something beneath words. The sound of flow of water over stone. Current moving through channel, time passing in liquid form. The river flows on, indifferent and ancient, the only witness that never speaks. And in its silence, perhaps, is the deepest truth that some things cannot be put into language, that some forms of knowing bypass words entirely, that to sit beside flowing water and simply be present is its own form of remembering, its own way of touching the eternal. Perhaps it was never meant to speak. Perhaps we were always meant to listen. The priestess who wore the moon's crown in the temple of Sin, moon god of yore, there lived a woman who belonged to no one and to everyone, who was bride without husband, mother without children, queen without kingdom. She wore the crown of the crescent moon and walked corridors where sunlight entered only as visitor, never as resident. The Into priestess. Even her title carries weight and meaning, Lord or High One, too, suggesting the feminine divine. She was chosen, always chosen, ever choosing. Born to royal blood, raised in palaces where power was a language spoken fluently, she was nevertheless set apart, marked from childhood as belonging not to the human world of marriage and succession, but to the celestial realm of ritual and sacred isolation. It is said that the ceremony of her consecration was conducted under the full moon, when sin's power was at its apex. She would have been young, perhaps 14, perhaps 16, standing before the assembled priests and nobles, her father the king looking on with pride or sorrow or some mixture both. She wore white, the color of moonlight, the color of purity, the color of limestone and bone, and things that have been stripped of all other hues. The crown was placed upon her head, not gold, though her family possessed gold enough to plate entire temples, not copper or bronze or silver, but something more precious in this context, a crown fashioned to evoke the crescent moon itself, curving horns of light rising from her brow, marking her as the moon's chosen consort, his bride in the realm between earth and heaven. And with that crowning, something ended and something else began. The girl she had been, with whatever dreams or fears, whatever hopes for ordinary love or ordinary life, died in that moment. What rose in her place was the Into, the one who would stand between humanity and the divine, the vessel through which prayers flowed upward and blessings descended. She entered the temple compound and did not leave. Not that year, Not in 10 years, not ever. The walls that enclosed the sacred precinct became the boundaries of her world. Within them, courtyards where date palms grew and fountains sang. Beyond them, the city of yore with its markets and homes, its births and deaths, its entire rushing river of ordinary life, all that became distant theoretical, a world she could see from the temple's high terraces, but could not touch. Whispers tell us her days followed patterns established centuries before, rituals so ancient that no one remembered their origins, only their necessity. She woke before dawn, the moon's priestess rose in darkness, naturally. There were ablutions to perform, her body washed in water drawn from sacred wells, her hands and feet anointed with oils whose formulas were temple secrets. She dressed in linen so fine, it was nearly transparent, layer upon layer, creating opacity through accumulation, creating a garment that whispered when she moved, that breathed with her breathing. Morning offerings. She would stand before the statue of Sin, that beautiful carved figure with its lapis beard and eyes of shell inlaid in bitumen, and recite prayers passed down through the lineage of Intu priestesses stretching back to the beginning of memory. Bread and dates, beer and honey, incense that rose in fragrant clouds and carried the prayers with it, smoke becoming spirit, physical becoming metaphysical. Midday brought purifications, not only of her own body but of the temple itself, of sacred vessels and ritual tools, of everything that stood between the human supplicants and their God. Purity was not a state achieved once and maintained, but a constant practice, a vigilance that required hourly attention. One speck of dust on an offering bowl, one impure thought during prayer, and the channel between worlds might close, the God might turn away, and who could say what disasters would follow? Evening was when her primary duty manifested. As the sun descended and the first stars appeared, as the sky transformed from blue to indigo to the deep darkness where the moon would rise, she sang. The hymns were complex, their melodies ancient, their words in Sumerian or Akkadian depending on which god received the prayer at which season. Her voice rose alone from the temple, carried on the evening breeze across the city, and the people of yore heard it, and knew the Intu was performing her office, knew the moon god was being honored, knew that for another day at least divine favor held. What did she think, this woman? What moved through her mind during the long hours of solitude? We have so few voices of women from the ancient world, their interior lives lost to us, their thoughts and feelings filtered through texts written by men about male concerns. But here, we have something extraordinary. In Hejawana, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, Intu priestess of yore, and the first author whose name we know. Not the first person to write. Writing had existed for centuries before her, but the first whose name was attached to their work, the first who claimed authorship, who said, "These words are mine, this voice is my voice, and I have something to say that deserves to be preserved." Her hymns survive on clay tablets copied and recopied across centuries, treasured by scribes who recognize something profound in them. They are addressed primarily to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, of contradictions held in divine tension, and they pulse with emotion, devotion and despair, desire and surrender, rage and resignation. "My queen, you who turn men to women and women to men," she wrote, "you who overturn mountains and make rivers run backward, whose rage makes the earth tremble, hear me." In these lines, we catch glimpses of a woman navigating complex relationships with the divine. Not simple piety, not passive acceptance, but wrestling, arguing, pleading. She describes being stripped of her position, cast out of the temple by political rivals, wandering in exile. The pain in those passages is visceral, immediate. "I who once sat in triumph now sit in the dust," she writes. "I who wore the crown now have only ashes on my head." Eventually she was restored, returned to her sacred office. But the poems remember the exile, preserve the memory of what it felt like to lose not just position but identity, to be cast out of the only world that gave her meaning. Beneath the silence of millennia, we imagine her chamber. Not large, asceticism was part of the calling. A room perhaps 15 feet square, with walls of sun-dried brick plastered smooth and painted white. A narrow bed, a table for writing, a niche in the wall where an oil lamp burned through the night, its small flame keeping watch while she slept. High windows, too high to look through without climbing, designed to admit moonlight but not views of the outer world. Picture moonlight falling through those windows, pulling on the stone floor like liquid silver. She would have seen this sight thousands of times, the moon in its phases moving across her room's geography, full and flooding, crescent and subtle, new and absent. The cycle repeated 12, 13 times a year, year after year, decade after decade. She aged in this service. Her body changed as all bodies change, from the suppleness of youth to the solidity of middle age, to whatever grace or fragility old age brought. But her role remained constant. She was always the bride, always newly chosen, always offering herself in ritual union with the divine. Time passed over her differently than it passed over other women. They moved through stages: daughter, wife, mother, grandmother, elder. She remained perpetually in one state, consecrated, set apart, belonging to the moon. There is melancholy in this devotion. We cannot deny it. She was spared certain sufferings, the dangers of childbirth that killed so many women, the subordination to a husband's will, the grief of children dying, the complicated politics of family alliances. But what did she lose? The touch of a lover chosen freely, the weight of a child in her arms, the ordinary joys of walking through a market, of visiting a friend's home, of moving through the world unbound by sacred obligation. Marked by the moon, crowned in silver light, the into walked her assigned pathways, temple to courtyard to shrine to chamber, the same stones beneath her feet, day after day, year after year. Did familiarity breed contentment or claustrophobia? Did the boundaries of her world feel like protection or prison? Where memory fades into empathy, we can only wonder. Perhaps she found transcendence in the repetition, the way that ritual performed with full attention can become meditation, can open doorways to states of consciousness unavailable to those distracted by ordinary life's demands. Perhaps in her isolation she discovered a kind of freedom, the freedom from choice, from the exhausting need to decide, from the weight of possibilities. Her path was set, her purpose was clear. In a chaotic world, perhaps that clarity was its own blessing. Or perhaps she raged against it, quietly, privately, in the hours between midnight and dawn, when even the moon slept. Perhaps she stood at those high windows and strained to glimpse the world beyond. Perhaps she wrote poems not preserved, prayers that were really protests, hymns that were really howls. We cannot know. The tablets that survive show us one face, the public face of priestess performing her sacred office. But every person has private faces, interior rooms where the authentic self lives. Hers are lost to us, as most ancient interiority is lost, leaving only questions suspended in time. In the soft darkness of our meditation, we join her in the temple garden at midnight. Date palms rustle in the evening breeze. A fountain murmurs its eternal conversation with itself. The moon rises, nearly full, casting shadows that are soft and complex. She walks the path she has walked it 10,000 times, and we walk beside her in imagination. Is she blessed or bound, sacred or sacrificed, free or captive? The answer shifts like moonlight on water, never quite solid, never quite graspable. Perhaps the question itself is false, born from our assumption that these must be opposites, that blessing and binding cannot coexist in the same life. Perhaps she understood something we have forgotten, that all dedication requires sacrifice, that all transcendence demands limitation, that to say yes to one path means saying no to infinite others. And this is true whether you are a priestess in ancient yore, or a person living in any age, making any choice about how to spend your singular, irreplaceable life. The moon continues its journey across the sky. The priestess completes her circuit of the garden and returns to her chamber. The temple sleeps, though part of it, her part, remains wakeful, vigilant, keeping watch through the hours of darkness. And somewhere in the realm where all forgotten things dwell, where all the into priestesses who ever lived gather in some imagined council, perhaps they speak among themselves. Perhaps they share what it was like to wear the moon's crown, to be chosen to serve. Perhaps in Hejowana is there, still writing, and still finding words for experiences that resist language. Or perhaps there is only silence, The sacred silence of the moon, which speaks without words, which illuminates without consuming, which waxes and wanes in eternal rhythm, indifferent to human questions about blessing or binding, freedom or captivity, seeing only its own reflected light in everything that lives below. Perhaps some questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the priestess knew that all along. The shadows cast by Hammurabi's stone. There is a stone that has outlasted the kingdom that carved it, that has survived empires rising and falling like tides, that stands now in a museum in Paris, silent witness to 40 centuries of human attempts to define what justice means. Black diorite, 8 feet tall, its surface polished to a sheen that catches light and throws it back, transformed, darker, weighted with the gravity of what is written there. This is the steel of Hammurabi, king of Babylon, lawgiver, the man who claimed to have received justice itself from the hands of a god, and made it permanent in stone. We approach it slowly, as one approaches all sacred objects with reverence and uncertainty both. At its summit, carved in relief that still holds crisp detail after 4,000 years, 2 figures meet. Hammurabi stands in the posture of reception, his right hand raised to his lips in a gesture of prayer or perhaps of silence, of listening. Before him sits Shamash, the sun god, deity of justice and truth, whose light illuminates all hidden things, whose gaze penetrates all shadows. From Shamash's hand extends something, a rod, a ring, symbols of divine authority and kingship, and Hammurabi receives them. This scene is crucial. It establishes that what follows is not merely human invention, not simply the preferences of one ruler imposed upon his subjects. What follows is divine mandate, cosmic order made visible, the will of heaven carved into earth's most enduring substance. Below this sacred transfer, the laws descend. 49 columns of cuneiform, each wedge-shaped mark pressed into the stone with such precision that they create rhythms, patterns, a kind of visual music. 282 pronouncements covering every aspect of human interaction that might require regulation, theft and property, marriage and divorce, commerce and debt, injury and recompense, slavery and freedom, life and death. It is said that Hammurabi's code is the origin of the phrase an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, the lex talionis, the law of retaliation, the principle that punishment should mirror harm. And indeed, the code contains such provisions. Law 196 states, if a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. Law 200, if a man knocks out the tooth of a man of his own rank, they shall knock out his tooth. There is a terrible symmetry in this. A balance that feels, at first consideration, like justice in its purest form. You take an eye, you lose an eye. The scales level. The universe restores itself to equilibrium. But approach closer. Read more carefully. The shadows deepen. Law 198. If a man destroys the eye of a commoner, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. Law 199. If he destroys the eye of a man's slave, he shall pay half the slave's price. Justice, it becomes clear, is calibrated according to social hierarchy. An eye is not simply an eye. The eye of a nobleman has one value, the eye of a commoner another, the eye of a slave yet another. The body itself is stratified, its parts assigned worth based on the social status of the person to whom they belong. Whispers tell us this was revolutionary nonetheless. Before written law codes, justice was arbitrary, dependent on the whim of local authorities, the memory of elders, the violence of blood feuds that could spiral through generations. A murder in one family demanded a murder in return, which demanded another murder, and another, until entire clans were decimated in cycles of revenge that had lost sight of the original harm. Hammurabi's code attempted to break these cycles. By defining exact consequences for exact actions, it made justice predictable. You knew, before you acted, what would follow. And more importantly, you knew when the debt was paid, when equilibrium was restored, when vengeance could cease and life could continue. The prologue to the code is eloquent, almost poetic in its claims. Hammurabi describes himself as the shepherd, the one who brings well-being to the people, chosen by the gods, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil-doers, so that the strong should not harm the weak. Noble words. But beneath the silence of the carved stone, questions gather like shadows at dusk. The code contains laws protecting women's property rights in divorce, allowing them to keep their dowries if their husbands leave them without cause. Progressive, for its time. Yet it also contains laws permitting a man to sell his wife and children into debt slavery, treating them as property to settle his obligations. It establishes standards for commercial transactions, protecting merchants from fraud, ensuring quality in goods sold. Yet, it also sets interest rates at levels that would trap the poor in permanent debt, that would transfer wealth steadily upward from those who labored to those who lent. It claims to protect the weak from the strong, yet many of its harshest penalties fall on slaves, on the poor, on those without power or position. A nobleman who kills a commoner's daughter in a building collapse pays a fine. A builder whose house collapses and kills the owner is executed, but if the dead are slaves, only compensation is required. Where memory fades into analysis, scholars debate endlessly what the code reveals about Babylonian society. Some see it as evidence of a relatively just system, especially for its era, with genuine concern for social order and protection of the vulnerable. Others read it as a document of control, cementing existing power structures, protecting property over people, creating the illusion of justice while maintaining fundamental inequalities. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps justice is always both liberation and limitation, both protection and control. To live in society requires rules, boundaries, consequences. But who makes the rules? Whose interests do they serve? These questions were urgent in ancient Babylon, and they remain urgent now. Marked by divine authority, carved in stone meant to outlast bronze and brick, the code was erected in public spaces throughout Hammurabi's kingdom. In city squares, in temple courtyards, in marketplaces, anywhere people gathered, they could read or hear the laws that governed them. This itself was revolutionary. Justice made public, accessible, knowable. But literacy was rare. Most people could not read the cuneiform script. They depended on scribes and officials to interpret the laws, to explain what the stone said. And in that interpretation, power remained concentrated in the hands of those who could read, who could claim to speak for the stone, for the law, for the God who gave the law to the king. The stone itself traveled through history like a prophet in exile. It was erected in Babylon around 1750 BCE, stood there for over 500 years, was then taken as war trophy by Elamite invaders and carried to their capital of Susa. There it stood for another 2.5 millennia, gradually buried in the ruins of that city, forgotten but preserved. In 1901, French archaeologists excavating Susa discovered it. They shipped it to Paris, to the Louvre, where it stands today in climate-controlled stillness, visited by thousands who cannot read its script, but can feel its weight, its presence, its claim to permanence and authority. Portions of the code were deliberately erased in antiquity, possibly by the Elamites who captured it, possibly later. Several columns of text are missing, ground smooth, the laws they contained lost forever. What did those missing sections say? What aspects of justice or injustice were they thought to contain that required their obliteration? We will never know. The stone keeps its own silences. Beneath the glow of museum lights, the steel casts shadows. They fall across the polished floor, dark and precise. And in those shadows, we might imagine other shadows, the shadows cast when the stone stood in Babylonian sunlight. When real people approached it seeking redress for real harms, when the laws carved there determined whether they would receive compensation or punishment, whether their losses would be acknowledged or dismissed, whether their status as human beings would be respected or reduced to a price in silver. In forgotten corners of legal history, Hammurabi's Code is often called the first law code. This is not quite accurate. The Code of Namu predates it by 3 centuries, and there were likely others before that, now lost. But Hammurabi's Code is the most complete, the most sophisticated, the most influential. Its principles echo through later law codes, the biblical laws of Exodus and Deuteronomy, the Roman 12 Tables, the Justinian Corpus Juris Civilis. The idea that law should be written, public, and applied consistently. This idea, perhaps, is Hammurabi's true legacy. Not the specific laws themselves, many of which we would find abhorrent, but the principle that justice requires transparency, that power must justify itself according to stated rules, that even kings claim to be bound by law. Though we might ask, were they? Hammurabi presented his code as divine and eternal, but did he follow it himself? Did later kings? Or was the code aspirational, a statement of how things should be rather than how they were, a form of royal propaganda claiming order and justice in a world where both remain perpetually elusive? As twilight gathers in our meditation, we sit before the stone in imagination. Its black surface reflects our faces darkly, as through a glass. We see ourselves in it, and in seeing ourselves, we recognize how little has changed. We still debate the purpose of law. Is it to reform or to punish, to protect society or to avenge victims? We still struggle with disparities, how the poor receive harsher sentences for similar crimes than the wealthy, how justice depends on who you are and who you can afford to defend you. We still carve our laws in permanent form, no longer in stone, but in legal codes and constitutions, and still discover that permanence is illusory, that interpretation shifts, that every generation must wrestle anew with what justice means. The stone stands, 8 feet of polished diorite, impossibly old and impossibly present. Shamash still extends his hand to Hammurabi. The laws still descend in precise columns, and the shadows still fall, long and complex, across the floor of the museum, across the millennia, across our continuing attempts to balance mercy and judgment, equality and order, the strong and the weak. Perhaps justice was never meant to be captured in stone. Perhaps it is always living, breathing, changing, a conversation rather than a pronouncement, a question rather than an answer, a shadow that shifts with the light. The stone endures, but what it means that remains open, contested, alive with possibility and danger both. In its shadows, we find not certainty but invitation, to keep asking, keep seeking, keep trying to build societies where the weak are protected, where the strong are restrained, where every eye matters equally regardless of whose eye it is. Perhaps some stones are meant to cast shadows rather than give light. Perhaps in those shadows, we find space to think, to question, to imagine justice, not as it was or is, but as it might yet become. The procession that never ended. Once a year, when the world stood balanced between what had been and what would be, when winter's grip loosened, but spring had not yet claimed its dominion, the city of Babylon became something more than stone and clay. It became a vessel for the sacred, a stage upon which the oldest story, the story of order wrestling chaos into submission, was enacted once again. The Akita festival. The words themselves carry the weight of antiquity, derived from Sumerian roots so ancient that their original meaning has dissolved into scholarly debate. But the festival's purpose remained constant across millennia, to ensure that the world would continue, that the sun would rise, that the seasons would turn, that chaos would not swallow everything back into the primordial void from which creation had emerged. 11 days and 11 nights. A ritual so intricate, so laden with symbolic meaning that to participate was to step outside ordinary time, to enter what the ancients understood as sacred time, Illud Tempus, that eternal moment when the gods first shaped the world, when everything that is came into being. We begin on the first day, when the city still slept in the pre-dawn darkness. In the Esagila, the great temple of Marduk, priests moved through chambers lit only by oil lamps, their shadows enormous on the walls, their footsteps echoing in the sacred silence. They carried water drawn from the Euphrates, blessed with incantations older than the temple itself, and with this water they washed the shrine where Marduk's statue stood. Purification. Everything must be purified: the temple, the vessels, the hands that would touch holy things, even the air itself, which they cleansed with smoke from burning cedar and juniper. The world was being prepared for the gods' return, for their reenactment of the cosmic drama upon which all existence depended. It is said that on the fourth day, when twilight gathered and the first stars appeared, the priests assembled in the temple's main hall. What happened next would take hours: the complete recitation of the Enuma Elish, the creation epic that explained how the world came to be. Picture it, priests standing before the assembly, their voices trained through years of practice to carry without shouting, to maintain rhythm without rushing, to breathe life into words that had been chanted for over 1,000 years. They spoke of the beginning, when there was only Apsu, the freshwater abyss, and Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, mingling their waters together. From this union, the gods were born, young gods, noisy gods, who disturbed the primordial silence with their energy and exuberance. Apsu wished to destroy them, to restore the quiet. But god of wisdom, struck first, killing Apsu and claiming his realm. Tiamat, enraged at her consort's death, transformed herself into a dragon of chaos, a monster armed with venom and storm, determined to unmake creation itself. The young gods trembled. None dared face her, until Marduk stepped forward. Marduk, son of young and strong and ambitious. He agreed to fight Tiamat, but demanded a price. If he won, he would become king of the gods, supreme above all others. Whispers tell us the battle was cosmic in scale. Marduk armed himself with winds, with lightning, with a net woven from the four corners of the world. When Tiamat opened her jaws to swallow him, he drove the winds into her mouth, inflating her body until she could not close it. Then he shot an arrow into her belly, piercing her heart, killing the mother of chaos. From her corpse, he made the world. Her skull became the vault of heaven. Her eyes became the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates. Her tail became the Milky Way. Her ribs became the mountains. From her body, from death, from violence, from the defeated dragon came order, structure, the world as humans know it. The recitation took hours. The priests' voices rose and fell in rhythmic waves, hypnotic, relentless. The assembled people, nobles and commoners, merchants and laborers stood or sat in the darkness, listening to words they knew by heart, waiting for the climax they had heard 100 times before. And yet, the story never grew old, because it was not history, but something more urgent. It was the explanation for why anything exists at all. Why chaos does not simply swallow everything, why there is light and life, instead of void and silence. Beneath the cadence of the chanted, a deeper truth resonated: order is not permanent. Chaos is not defeated once and for all. The battle must be fought again. Every year, every generation, every moment. On the 8th day, something extraordinary occurred. The king god's representative on earth, the guarantor of order in the human realm, approached Marduk's statue in the inner sanctum. But he did not approach as king. He came stripped of his regalia, divested of the symbols that marked his power. The high priest met him there. In a ritual whose strangeness still reverberates across the centuries, the priest took the king's crown, his scepter, his ring, all the insignia of kingship, and set them before Marduk's statue. Then the priest struck the king across the cheek. Not symbolically, actually struck him, hard enough to sting, to shock, to humble. The king knelt, wept, declared his innocence, or perhaps confessed his failures. The texts are ambiguous, and perhaps that ambiguity was intentional. He was, in that moment, not king but supplicant, not ruler but servant, stripped of everything that elevated him above ordinary humanity. Only then did the priest return the crown, the scepter, the ring. Only after this ritual humiliation, this acknowledgement that all power flows from the divine and returns to the divine, was the king restored to his office. Some scholars suggest this was political theater, a way to remind kings that their authority was conditional. Others see it as genuinely religious, a moment when even the most powerful person in the kingdom had to confront his own mortality, his own dependence on forces beyond his control. And then the procession began, marked by ceremony, blessed by days of preparation. The statues of all the gods were brought out from their temples. Not the actual gods, of course. No one believed the divine essence resided permanently in carved wood and stone. But the statues were vessels, dwelling places the gods could inhabit when invoked with proper ritual. And for the Akita festival, they were all invoked, all called to participate in the cosmic drama. They were placed on platforms carried by priests, wrapped in fine linen, adorned with jewelry, crowned with flowers. And then, the procession moved through the city, through the streets, where ordinary life was suspended, where no work was done, no trade conducted, nothing existed except this great river of ritual flowing through Babylon's heart. The Ishtar Gate opened before them, that magnificent structure of blue-glazed brick, its surface alive with dragons and bulls, became a threshold between the city and something beyond the city, between human space and sacred space. The procession passed through, emerging onto the processional way. Imagine walking beside them, one among thousands. The air is thick with incense, frankincense, and myrrh, cedar smoke, and the sweet scent of flowers scattered in the path. Musicians play drums whose rhythm matches your heartbeat, becomes your heartbeat, until you cannot tell where the music ends and your body begins. Lyres sing in harmonies that seem to come from beyond the human, that suggest the music of spheres, of planets wheeling through their courses, of the cosmos itself humming with order. You walk and walk, following the gods who are following Marduk, who is being carried toward the Bedtime, the special temple built outside the walls specifically for this ritual. The journey takes hours. Your feet ache, the sun beats down, but you do not stop, because to stop would be to break the chain, to interrupt the sacred flow, to risk everything coming undone. At the Bedtime, the final act of the cosmic drama unfolds. The details are lost to us. The rituals performed there were secret, known only to initiates, but we know the essential truth. Marduk defeated chaos again, symbolical ritually, but no less really for being symbolic. Order was reaffirmed. The new year was secured. The world would continue for another cycle. Where memory fades into feeling, we sense the collective relief. The people of Babylon carried a knowledge that our electrically lit, scientifically explained world has mostly lost. The knowledge that order is fragile, that chaos always presses at the edges, that the continuation of the world is not guaranteed, but must be fought for, must be ritually renewed, must be earned through right action and proper worship. The procession returned. The gods were carried back through the Ishtar Gate, back to their temples, back to their shrines, where they would dwell for another year. The festival ended. Ordinary time resumed. People returned to their work, their trade, their everyday concerns. But the procession never truly ended. It merely paused. It gathered breath. It waited. Because next year, when spring balanced again on winter's edge, when the world stood once more between what had been and what would be, the Akita festival would begin again. The temples would be purified. The Enuma Elish would be chanted. The king would be stripped and restored. The gods would process through the streets. Marduk would defeat Tiamat once more. In forgotten corners of religious history, scholars trace the echoes of the Akita festival forward through time. The Jewish Passover carries elements of it: the ritual meal, the recitation of sacred history, the communal participation in cosmic drama. The Christian Easter, with its themes of death and resurrection, of chaos defeated and order restored, resonates with the Akita frequencies. The Islamic Hajj, with its massive processions and ritual actions performed at specific locations, echoes the structure. Different theologies, different gods, different stories, but perhaps the same deep truth: that communities need ritual, need to enact together. The stories that hold their worlds together need to participate physically, with feet walking, with voices chanting, with bodies moving through sacred space, in the maintenance of order against the ever-present threat of chaos. The drums still echo, if we listen carefully. The incense still rises, if we breathe deeply. The procession still moves through the streets of vanished Babylon, still passes through the Ishtar Gate that stands now only in museums, and memory still carries the gods toward their annual victory over the darkness that would swallow everything. Perhaps all ritual is eternal in this way. Perhaps when we light candles on birthdays, when we gather for holidays, when we mark the turning of seasons with festivals and feasts, we are still processing with the gods, still walking the ancient paths, still affirming that order matters, that chaos can be defeated, that the world will continue because we choose to continue it, because we participate in its continuation through the sacred theater of ritual. The Akita festival ended 2,000 years ago. The last procession passed through the Ishtar Gate. The last priest chanted the last line of the Enuma Elish. The last king was struck and restored. but somewhere in the realm where all sacred actions persist, where all ritual time is eternally present, the procession continues. The drums still beat. The gods still move through the streets. Marduk still faces Tiamat, and the outcome, though we know the story by heart, still matters, still hangs in balance, still requires our participation, our attention, our willingness to believe that chaos can be defeated, that order can be maintained, that the world, improbable and precious, will see another spring. The procession never ended. It only waits for us to join it, to take our place among the thousands, to add our footsteps to the sacred path, to help carry the story forward into whatever comes next. The palace where ghosts spoke in clay in the heart of Babylon, where the Euphrates bent like a question mark through the alluvial plain, there stood a palace so vast that a person could walk its corridors for hours, and still discover rooms they had never seen, courtyards they had not yet crossed, gardens they had only heard whispered about by servants who tended them in the early morning silence. Nebuchadnezzar's palace. The Southern Palace, as archaeologists later named it, though to those who lived in its shadow, needed no such designation. It was simply the palace, the center from which power radiated outward like heat from a furnace, the place where the fate of nations was decided over wine and bread, where treaties were signed and armies were dispatched, where a king paced in the darkness and wrestled with dreams that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the human realm. We enter at twilight, when the ruins show most clearly what they once were, when shadows fill the empty doorways and give them depth again, when the mind can more easily strip away the centuries and see the palace as it stood, walls plastered smooth and painted with murals in lapis blue and ochre gold, floors paved with fired brick, courtyards where fountains sang their eternal one-note songs, gardens where date palms cast intricate shadows across pathways walked by kings and captives both. The throne room was here. Its foundations remain massive walls that once supported vaulted ceilings 40 feet high, creating a space designed to overwhelm, to reduce visitors to the proper scale of awe and submission. When ambassadors entered from Egypt or Persia, from the mountain kingdoms of Anatolia or the distant cities of India, they walked through a succession of doors, each one smaller than the last, each one forcing them to bow lower until finally they entered the throne room already in the posture of supplication. It is said that the walls were covered in glazed brick murals depicting lions in mid-stride, their muscles tensed, their eyes fierce, their presence a reminder that the king commanded not only human armies, but the primal forces of nature itself. Between the lions were palm trees, stylized and geometric, their fronds spreading in patterns that suggested order, cultivation, the transformation of wilderness into garden. The colors were intense cobalt blue, chrome yellow, white as bone, colors that caught lamplight and transformed it into something more than mere illumination, into a kind of visual music. Here, Nebuchadnezzar received tribute: gold from Egypt, horses from the northern steppes, incense from Arabia, precious stones from lands so distant their names were legends even then. Scribes recorded everything in cuneiform on clay tablets: the quantity, the quality, the name of the giver, the date received. These tablets accumulated in archives like sediment at the bottom of a sea, layer upon layer, creating a record so detailed that modern scholars can reconstruct entire economic systems, trace trade routes, understand the flow of wealth through the ancient Near East. But the palace held more than administrative records. It held dreams. The Book of Daniel, written centuries later but preserving memories of the Babylonian court, describes Nebuchadnezzar as a man haunted by visions that came to him in sleep. In the most famous of these dreams, he saw a tree, not an ordinary tree, but a cosmic tree, its top reaching to heaven, visible to all the earth's ends. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, providing food for all. Birds nested in its branches, beasts found shelter in its shade. Then a voice came from heaven: cut down the tree, strip off its leaves, scatter its fruit, but leave the stump in the ground, bound with iron and bronze, until 7 times pass over it. Whispers tell us the king woke in terror, his body cold with sweat, his heart pounding against his ribs. He summoned his wise men, his magicians, his astrologers, demanded interpretation. They could not provide it. Finally, Daniel, a Hebrew captive, an exile in the very court that had destroyed his homeland, was brought before the king. Daniel's interpretation was not kind. The tree was Nebuchadnezzar himself, grown great and strong, reaching to heaven, dominating all beneath his shadow. But pride had infected the roots. Divine decree demanded humbling. The king would be driven from human society, would eat grass like cattle, would dwell with wild beasts, until he acknowledged that sovereignty belongs not to human rulers, but to powers beyond the human. Whether this dream was historical memory or theological parable, we cannot say with certainty, but something about it rings true: the image of a powerful man lying awake in his vast palace, surrounded by all the evidence of his accomplishments, yet haunted by intimations of impermanence, by the whisper that all this magnificence is temporary, that trees fall and kingdoms crumble, and even the greatest rulers eventually return to dust. Beneath the silence of the archaeological record, we find evidence that supports at least the outline of the story. Every brick in the palace was stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name, literally millions of bricks, each one carrying the cuneiform inscription, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, as if saying it enough times could make it permanent, as if repetition were a spell against mortality. The excavations revealed throne rooms and audience chambers, yes, but also private quarters, smaller rooms where the king might retreat from the weight of kingship, where he could remove the crown and simply be a man, troubled and mortal. They found vaulted cellars where wine was stored in enormous jars, their clay stoppers still bearing seal impressions. They found storerooms packed with tablets documenting everything from grain supplies to military campaigns, from labor requisitions to diplomatic correspondence. In one archive room, tablets recorded the conquest of Jerusalem in 597 BCE, and again in 586 BCE, the destruction of the temple, the deportation of the Hebrew elite craftsmen, priests, nobles marched hundreds of miles to Babylon to live as exiles in a foreign land. The plunder taken from Solomon's temple, gold vessels, bronze pillars, sacred objects transformed into war trophies. These tablets were administrative documents, dry accounting of strategic decisions. But between the lines, we sense the human cost: families torn apart, a city burning, a people's sacred center destroyed, their God apparently defeated by Babylon's God, their faith tested in ways that would reshape an entire religious tradition. And in another part of the palace, perhaps at the very moment these conquests were being recorded, musicians tuned their lyres for an evening banquet. Cooks prepared elaborate dishes: roasted meats, honeyed fruits, bread made from the finest flour. Servants polished silver cups and arranged flowers in the courtyard fountains. Life continued in its dual nature: beauty and brutality, celebration and cruelty, existing not in contradiction, but in terrible simultaneity. This is what palaces do. They contain multitudes. They are stages where power performs itself, where the machinery of empire is housed and hidden, where the grand gestures of statecraft are planned in private before being enacted in public. They are museums of ambition, libraries of control, gardens where authority is cultivated like a rare flower that requires constant attention or it will wither. Marked by royal seal, blessed by priests, built by thousands of laborers whose names were never recorded, the palace sprawled across acres in Babylon's heart. Chambers within chambers, halls that led to courtyards that opened into gardens that concealed libraries. A maze of power, intentionally complex, designed so that visitors would always be slightly lost, always dependent on guides, always aware that they were in a space that exceeded their understanding. Where memory fades into ruins, archaeologists have traced the palace's outline. They've excavated foundations, measured walls, reconstructed floor plans on paper, but so much remains unknown. The upper stories have collapsed. The wooden beams that supported ceilings have rotted away. The gardens have long since returned to desert. What we have are fragments enough to suggest the scale, to hint at the magnificence, but never enough to fully recreate the experience of walking these halls when they were alive with power and presence. What conversations echoed in these courtyards? What decisions were made in these chambers that shaped the course of history? What private sorrows did the king carry as he paced these pathways in the hours before dawn, when even emperors are alone with their thoughts? The ghosts speak, if we listen carefully enough, but they speak in clay, in the tablets that survived, in the bricks that bear the king's name, in the foundations that still describe the room's dimensions. They speak in fragments, in gaps, in the spaces between what is known and what can only be imagined. As darkness deepens in our meditation, we walk slowly through the ruins. The walls rise around us, or the memory of walls, or the shadow that walls cast even after they've fallen. Wind moves through empty doorways, carrying with it the dust of millennia, particles that were once plaster, once paint, once the very air that Nebuchadnezzar breathed. In forgotten corners, perhaps, some echo lingers. The sound of footsteps on stone floors, the whisper of royal robes trailing across pavement, the distant music of a banquet that ended 2.5 millennia ago, but somehow continues in the realm where all ended things persist. The palace stands as warning and invitation both. Warning that all empires build grand halls, that all power seeks to house itself in permanence, that all kings stamp their names on bricks as if naming could conquer time. And yet all halls eventually fall silent, all rooms empty, all gardens return to wilderness, but also invitation to remember, to reconstruct in imagination what archaeology can only partially recover, to understand that these were real people who walked these real floors, who struggled with real questions about power and mortality, legacy and loss, the meaning of greatness in a world where everything eventually crumbles. Beneath the starlight that illuminated Babylon then and illuminates its ruins now, the palace persists. Not in brick, but in story. Not in walls, but in the human capacity to create and destroy, to build magnificently and to see those buildings fall, to dream of permanence in a universe composed entirely of change. Perhaps some palaces are meant to become ruins. Perhaps in their falling, they speak more eloquently than they ever did when whole, teaching lessons that grandeur cannot teach, offering wisdom that power always refuses to hear. The ghosts speak in clay, and the clay, patient and eternal, holds the voices until we are ready to listen, until we can hear in their whispers not just the story of one king or one empire, but the story of all human striving, all mortal ambition, all the beautiful, terrible things we build and leave behind. The wind continues through the empty courtyards. The dust settles. The silence deepens. And somewhere in that silence, the palace dreams its own dreams of the days when it was whole, when it was home, when it housed the living, rather than haunting the imagination of those who come centuries later, seeking in the ruins some answer to questions they barely know how to ask. The dreamer who rebuilt the world in vision. There is a king who walks through history with two faces, who exists in two narratives that never quite reconcile, who stands at the intersection of conqueror and creator-destroyer and dreamer, the man who burned Jerusalem and the man who built gardens that seemed to float in air. Nebuchadnezzar. Even his name is doubled, part Akkadian, part divine invocation. Nabu Kaduri Usur, Nabu, protect my boundary stone, a prayer embedded in an identity. A plea for preservation wrapped around the very syllables of his being. He haunts Babylon like a restless spirit, his presence so saturated into the city's stones that you cannot separate the king from the kingdom, the dreamer from the dream. Walk through the ruins in the blue hour before dawn, when darkness begins its slow retreat, but has not yet surrendered, and you might sense him still pacing the palace corridors, climbing to the roof to look out over his creation, wrestling with visions that came to him unbidden in the vulnerable hours of sleep. History remembers him first as warrior, as the king who broke nations. In 597 BCE, his armies besieged Jerusalem, accepting its surrender, taking tribute and hostages. 9 years later, when rebellion flared again, he returned without mercy. The city burned. The temple, Solomon's temple, sacred center of Hebrew faith, was stripped of its treasures, its priests, its purpose. Its walls were pulled down. Its people were marched in chains across hundreds of miles of desert to live as exiles in the very city their captors had built. The Book of Kings records it with stark brevity. He carried away all Jerusalem, all the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained, except the poorest people of the land. But beneath this narrative of conquest lies another story, quieter but no less powerful. Nebuchadnezzar was not merely destroyer but builder on a scale that staggers imagination. The Babylon he inherited was already ancient, already grand. The Babylon he left behind was something else entirely, a city transformed into a vision made solid, a dream rendered in brick and bitumen, a place where the boundary between human achievement and divine creation seemed to dissolve. The Ishtar Gate rose at his command, that impossible structure of glazed brick in lapis blue, 40 feet high, covered with dragons and bulls that never existed except in the space between mythology and art. The processional way stretched from the gate to the heart of the city, its walls lined with lions walking in eternal parade, leading pilgrims toward the Temple of Marduk. Whispers tell us he may have built the Hanging Gardens, though evidence remains elusive, caught between archaeological silence and literary testimony. But whether he built them or not, the impulse was the desire to create paradise, to make green terraces rise from desert flatness, to command water to flow upward, to transform barrenness into abundance through will and engineering and the labor of thousands. He restored temples that had stood empty for centuries, their rituals forgotten, their priests scattered. The Ziggurat-e-Temenanki, the Tower of Babel of biblical memory, had crumbled to a ruin. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt it, 7 tiers ascending toward heaven, each one painted a different sacred color, crowned with a shrine where heaven and earth could meet. The bricks themselves testify to his devotion, millions of them, each stamped with cuneiform that reads, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, provider for Esagila and Isaiah, eldest son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. The repetition is not mere vanity but ritual, each brick a prayer, each building a offering, the entire city a hymn in clay to Marduk, chief god of Babylon, the deity who defeated chaos and created order from Tiamat's corpse. Yet the Book of Daniel preserves a different Nebuchadnezzar, proud to the point of madness, demanding worship as if he were divine, throwing faithful men into furnaces when they refused to bow before his golden statue, suffering divine punishment in the form of a descent into animal consciousness. Eating grass like cattle, his body drenched with dew, his hair growing like eagle's feathers, his nails like birds' claws. It is said that this madness lasted 7 years or 7 times. The text is ambiguous until humility was forced upon him, until he acknowledged that kingship belongs ultimately not to mortals, but to powers beyond the human realm. Only then, the story tells us, was his reason restored, his kingdom returned, his authority re-established. Which story is true? Which Nebuchadnezzar was real? Perhaps this is the wrong question. Perhaps both existed in the same body, the same mind, the same soul, pulled between contradictory impulses that never resolved into simple coherence. The brilliant architect and the brutal tyrant. The devoted worshipper and the arrogant god-king. The dreamer who saw visions of cosmic trees and interpreted them as warnings, yet continued building as if permanence were possible. His dreams trouble him throughout the biblical narrative, as if some part of him, perhaps the part that woke at 3 in the morning, the hour when all defenses are down, and truth seeps through, knew that grandeur is temporary, that empires built on conquest contain the seeds of their own dissolution, that even the greatest works eventually return to dust. In one dream, he saw a statue magnificent, its head of gold, its chest of silver, its belly of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet part iron and part clay. A stone cut without hands struck the feet, and the entire structure collapsed, became chaff blown away by wind. Daniel interpreted, the golden head was Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, glorious, but doomed to give way to lesser kingdoms, each one weaker than the last, until finally even the memory of empire would crumble. In another dream, the cosmic tree reaching heaven, feeding all, sheltering all until the divine decree came, cut it down. Marked by vision, haunted by prophecy, Nebuchadnezzar built anyway. Perhaps this is the essence of human greatness: to build knowing that what you build will fall, to create knowing that creation is temporary, to pour your life into works that will outlast you, but not outlast time itself. Where memory fades into archaeology, we find evidence of his building everywhere. The bricks bear his name. The inscriptions proclaim his achievements. He widened the Euphrates channels to prevent flooding. He constructed a network of canals to irrigate fields. He raised Babylon's walls to heights that ancient writers claimed were impossible, 300 feet tall, so wide that chariots could race along the top. Herodotus, visiting Babylon more than a century after Nebuchadnezzar's death, wrote that it surpasses in wonder any city of the known world. The city covered nearly 4 square miles. Its double walls enclosed temples and palaces, gardens and workshops, homes and markets, a complete world unto itself. But Nebuchadnezzar was not there to see Herodotus's wonder. He died around 562 BCE, after ruling for 43 years. The circumstances of his death are not recorded. We know only that he was succeeded by his son, who ruled poorly and briefly, and that within a generation, the empire he had built began its decline. Beneath the silence of his final years, we can only imagine. An old man now, his body worn by decades of kingship, surrounded by the magnificence he had created. Did he walk the palace corridors at night, unable to sleep, as he had in his youth? Did he climb to the roof and look out over Babylon spread beneath him, the ziggurat rising like a mountain from the plain, the Ishtar Gate glowing blue in the moonlight, the Euphrates reflecting stars as it flowed through the city's heart? What did he think, looking at all this? Pride, certainly, but perhaps also melancholy, the knowledge that comes to all builders eventually that the work is never quite finished, that vision always exceeds execution, that the city in his mind was more perfect than the city of brick and mortar could ever be. And perhaps, in those final wakeful hours, the dreams return. The tree cut down to a stump, the statue with feet of clay, struck and crumbling, the golden head giving way to silver, bronze, iron, and finally dust. Did he understand, then, what the dreams had been trying to tell him all along? That greatness and fragility are not opposites but twins. That the higher you build the harder the fall, that all human works are written in sand at the edge of an incoming tide. In forgotten corners of Babylon's ruins, archaeologists find layers of construction walls built over earlier walls, temples raised on the foundations of more ancient temples, the city rebuilding itself generation after generation. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was not the first Babylon, and it would not be the last. The city was old when he was born, and it continued after his death, until gradually it faded, was abandoned, was buried beneath sand and sediment and the slow accumulation of centuries. But the dreamer persists. In the archaeological record, yes, but also in the collective memory of civilizations that came after, that read his story and saw in it something of themselves: the ambition, the hubris, the creativity, the cruelty, the strange combination of vision and blindness that characterizes all human empire. He left us a city of contradictions, beautiful and terrible, sacred and profane, built to last forever, and already, even in its moment of completion, beginning the slow process of return to dust. Perhaps that is what the dreams were about: not prophecy but recognition, not prediction but acceptance. The understanding that all creation is temporary, that we build anyway, because our works will last, but because building is what we do, because the impulse to create, to transform, to leave something behind, is woven into the fabric of human consciousness. As night deepens in our meditation, we sit with Nebuchadnezzar in that liminal space between sleep and waking, between the world as it is and the world as it might be. The dreamer who rebuilt the world in brick and vision. The king who destroyed and created. The man who was neither fully human or entirely legend, but something in between mortal and mythic, conqueror and architect, destroyer and dreamer. The city he built is gone, but the questions he embodied remain. What do we build, and why? What do we destroy to make space for our visions? How do we live with the knowledge that everything we create will eventually crumble? And is there meaning in the building itself, in the act of creation, even when creation is temporary. Perhaps some voices echo not to give answers, but to keep the questions alive. Perhaps the dreamer dreams still, in the realm where all builders gather, still raising walls, still planting gardens, still reaching toward heaven, even knowing that heaven remains eternally just out of reach. The stars turn overhead, the same stars that shone on Babylon. Then, the darkness holds us gently, and somewhere in that darkness, the dreamer sleeps at last, his visions finally quiet, his work whatever it meant, whatever it accomplished complete. The silence where the last prayer faded. There is a kind of death that comes not with fire or sword, not with the crash of walls or the cries of the conquered, but with silence, a slow, creeping quiet that spreads like twilight, room by room, street by street, temple by temple, until finally no voice remains that remembers the old songs, no mouth that can shape the ancient prayers, no ear that recognizes the sacred words when they are spoken. This is how Babylon died. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, imperceptibly, like a flame that dims so slowly you didn't notice it fading until suddenly you realize you are sitting in darkness and cannot remember when the light went out. Alexander the Great entered Babylon in 331 BCE, and the city received him as cities receive all conquerors, with a mixture of pragmatism and hope, resignation and curiosity. But Alexander was different from other conquerors. He did not come to destroy. He came, he claimed, to restore. He found Babylon magnificent, even in its partial decay, and he planned to make it his capital, the center from which he would rule an empire stretching from Greece to India. It is said that he ordered the restoration of the great ziggurat-etem Ananke, the Tower of Babel, which had fallen into ruin. He commanded that temples be repaired, that the ancient rituals be revived, that Babylon should rise again to its former glory. The city, for a brief moment, must have felt the stir of hope, that perhaps this foreign king would be the one to reverse the slow decline, to restore what time and neglect had eroded. But Alexander died in Babylon, in one of Nebuchadnezzar's palaces, in the heat of June. Fever took him. He was 32 years old. His empire, held together by the force of his personality and the momentum of his victories, immediately began to fracture. His generals, the Diadochi, the successors, fought over the corpse of his conquests, carving it into pieces, each claiming a portion, none able to hold the whole. And Babylon, caught in the middle of these power struggles, began to fade. Not immediately. The decline was gradual, barely noticeable at first. One temple closed, its priests too old, and no young ones trained to replace them. One neighborhood emptied as residents moved to Seleucia, the new capital the Greeks built on the Tigris. One ritual was not performed 1 year, and then the next year no one remembered it had ever been performed at all. Whispers tell us that the Euphrates itself abandoned the city. Rivers are not constant. They shift, meander, seek new channels. Over decades and centuries, the Euphrates moved westward, leaving the ancient waterways that ran through Babylon increasingly dry. Without the river's water, the irrigation canals ceased to function. Without irrigation, the gardens died. Without water, people left. By the time Strabo the geographer wrote in the 1st century BC, he described Babylon as mostly deserted, so that one would not hesitate to apply the words of the comic poet: "The great city is a great desert, the great city, a great desert." The transformation captured in 7 words. Temples fell into disrepair. The ziggurat, which Alexander had ordered restored, was never completed. It stood as a ruin, a monument to abandoned ambitions. The Ishtar Gate, that magnificent structure of glazed blue brick with its dragons and bulls, slowly disappeared beneath accumulating sand and debris. The processional way, once walked by thousands during the Akita festival, grew silent. Weeds pushed up between its paving stones. Wind carried sand into the spaces where hymns had once been sung. But the language persisted, for a time. Cuneiform, that ancient script of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay, continued to be written. Priests still recorded astronomical observations, tracking Venus and Jupiter, charting eclipses, maintaining the tradition of celestial mathematics that stretched back millennia. The last cuneiform tablet written in Babylon is dated. We know precisely when it was created, 75 CE, nearly 400 years after Alexander's death. It contains, fittingly, an astronomical observation, Venus's position recorded in wedge-shaped script. The stars charted one final time in the language that had charted them for 3,000 years. And then silence. No more tablets. No more inscriptions. The language died. Not everywhere, all at once. Cuneiform continued in other cities for a few more decades, but in Babylon, the birthplace of so much written culture, the voice went quiet in 75 CE. After that, the city existed only as echo, as memory, as rumor and prophecy. Beneath the silence of those empty centuries, sand accumulated. Wind carried it grain by grain from the desert, depositing it in abandoned courtyards, in empty temples, in the streets where no feet walked. A foot of sand in a century, then 2 feet, then 10, then 30. The city buried itself, or was buried, pulled slowly down into the earth, like something returning to the elements from which it had been shaped. For centuries, for more than a millennium, Babylon existed primarily in texts. In the Bible, where it was coded as corruption, as the place of exile, as the symbolic opposite of Jerusalem. Prophets had pronounced judgment against it. Babylon shall become heaps, a dwelling place for jackals, an object of horror and hissing, without inhabitant, and so it seemed to come to pass. Greek and Roman writers preserved descriptions. Herodotus and Strabo, Diodorus Siculus and Pliny the Elder, each adding details, sometimes accurate, sometimes fantastical, creating a literary Babylon that was part memory, part imagination, part moral fable about human pride and divine punishment. Desert nomads camped in the ruins, unaware they slept among the remains of empire. They saw only low mounds, strange shapes beneath the sand, occasionally fragments of glazed brick or broken statuary. They had their own names for these places, their own stories unconnected to the ancient city that slept beneath their camps. Where memory fades, legend grows. Babylon became synonymous with confusion, with the scattering of languages, with the tower built too high and cast down. It became a symbol in Christian apocalyptic literature, the whore of Babylon, drunk on the blood of saints, the great city destined for destruction, the epitome of human corruption and divine wrath. The actual city, meanwhile, continued its slow dissolution beneath the sand. Then, in the 19th century, curiosity returned. European archaeologists, armed with shovels and stratigraphic theories, with knowledge of ancient languages and access to funding, began to dig. They were looking for confirmation of biblical stories, for treasures to fill museums, for knowledge about civilizations that had been lost. What they found exceeded expectation. The Ishtar Gate emerged from 30 feet of accumulated debris, its blue glaze still brilliant after millennia underground. The processional way revealed itself, lions still walking in endless parade along its walls. Tablets by the thousands, tens of thousands, were recovered from archives and libraries, from temple storerooms and palace cellars. Languages returned from death. Cuneiform was deciphered. Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian tongues that had been silent for 2,000 years began to speak again, telling stories no one alive had heard, preserving voices from the deep past. It is said that when archaeologists first read the Epic of Gilgamesh from tablets excavated in Mesopotamia, they discovered a flood story that predated Noah, a tale of friendship and loss that resonated across 4,000 years. The past was not silent, after all. It had only been waiting, patient as clay, for someone to remember how to listen. But some essential things remain lost. The sound of prayers sung in Marduk's temple. What did they sound like, those hymns chanted daily for 1,000 years? What melody carried the words? What emotion infused the voices? We have the texts, but we've lost the music. We can read the words but cannot hear them as they were meant to be heard. The scent of incense on festival mornings. The archaeological record can tell us what was burned, frankincense, myrrh, cedar, but it cannot recreate the experience of standing in the temple courtyard as dawn broke, as the smoke rose, as the scent mixed with morning air, and the murmur of thousands gathering for ritual. The precise color of moonlight on the Euphrates when the city was young. We can see moonlight on water now, but this moonlight, this water, this particular intersection of light and liquid and landscape that is gone. That exists now only in the imagination, in the space between what we know and what we can never know. Marked by absence, defined by loss, Babylon persists as silence and as the breaking of silence, as forgetting and as the struggle against forgetting. In forgotten corners of museum archives, tablets still await translation. Languages partially understood, texts copied but not yet read, voices recorded in clay but not yet heard. The silence is not complete. Fragments remain, and in those fragments, perhaps, are pieces of the prayers we thought were lost, echoes of the hymns we believed had faded entirely. As darkness deepens in our meditation, we sit with this long silence. We accept that some things cannot be recovered, that some losses are permanent, that the past remains forever partly veiled, accessible, but not entirely knowable. Babylon rises and falls in our remembering. Each generation rebuilds it according to its own needs, as warning or wonder, as symbol of pride or lesson in humility, as evidence of human achievement or human folly. The city in the historical record and the city in imagination are not quite the same, and perhaps they never were. The silence speaks, if we listen carefully enough. It speaks of impermanence, of the way all civilizations are temporary, all languages eventually fall silent, all temples eventually empty. But it also speaks of resilience, of the human impulse to preserve, to remember, to dig through 30 feet of sand to recover voices that have been quiet for 2,000 years. The dust holds memory. Clay preserves what flesh forgets, and somewhere beneath the ruins, beneath the sand and centuries, the last prayer still fades not into nothing but into the vast silence that holds all ended things, all completed songs, all voices that have spoken their final words. Perhaps that silence is not empty. Perhaps it is full of everything that was, everything that mattered, everything that lives now in the space between remembering and forgetting, between knowledge and mystery, between the words we can recover and the words that remain forever just beyond our reach. The stars still turn overhead, the same stars the Babylonian astronomers charted. And perhaps that is enough, that some continuity persists, that we can still see what they saw, that the sky connects us across the gulf of centuries, that we are not entirely alone in our moment, but linked however tenuously to all the moments that came before. The silence deepens, the last prayer fades, and we, listening in the darkness, become part of the story, inheritors of a silence that speaks, guardians of memories that are not quite memories, witnesses to a presence that announces itself most eloquently through absence. Perhaps some cities are meant to fall silent, so that we might learn to listen more carefully. Perhaps some voices fade so that we might understand the preciousness of voice, the miracle of speech, the gift of language that allows us to speak across time, to preserve what would otherwise be lost, to resist, even if only partially, even if only temporarily, the silence that eventually claims everything. Babylon sleeps beneath the sand, and in sleeping, it dreams dreams of the days when its temples rang with prayers, when its streets flowed with processions, when the Euphrates reflected moonlight, when no one could imagine a time when the city would be empty, when the language would be forgotten, when silence would spread through every chamber and courtyard and sacred hall. But even in silence, even in sand and ruin and loss, something persists, some essence, some truth that cannot be destroyed, because it never existed entirely in stone or clay, but in the human capacity to create, to build, to dream cities into being, and to mourn them when they fall. The prayer fades, but the fading itself is wholly a reminder that all things pass, that endings are as sacred as beginnings. That silence is not the opposite of speech, but its necessary complement, the space in which words can finally rest, having said all they needed to say. The mystery written in broken brick. There is a city beneath the city, a Babylon beneath Babylon, layers upon layers of unexcavated truth sleeping in darkness, waiting for hands that may never come, for questions that may never be asked, for light that may never penetrate the accumulated weight of sand and centuries. Less than 1%, That is what archaeologists have uncovered of ancient Babylon's expanse. One fragment of 100, one glimpse through a doorway into a mansion of 1,000 rooms. The rest remains sealed, silent, holding its secrets with the patience that only Earth possesses. We descend into this unknown, not with shovels, but with imagination, feeling our way through darkness toward possibilities that may or may not exist. Somewhere beneath our feet, if we were standing on the plains of Mesopotamia, if we were walking across the mounds that mark where Babylon once stood, there are chambers no human has entered for 3,000 years. Tablets pressed with words no modern eye has read. Walls painted with images no contemporary mind has interpreted. Objects placed carefully in storage rooms and left there when the last person walked away, when the city finally emptied, when silence claimed the streets and courtyards and sacred halls. Ground-penetrating radar whispers suggestions, anomalies in the soil density, patterns that might indicate foundations, walls, buried architecture. But radar cannot read cuneiform. It cannot distinguish between a storage room filled with administrative records and a temple library containing sacred texts. It cannot tell us whether what it detects is mundane or miraculous, ordinary or extraordinary. It can only say, here, something is buried. Here, something waits. What might we find if we dug deeper? The question hangs in the air like incense smoke, like possibility itself made visible. In the fragments already recovered, we have found wonders: the Code of Hammurabi, the Epic of Gilgamesh, astronomical observations of extraordinary precision, mathematical tablets, teaching methods we still use. But these are the accidents of preservation, the chance survivals, the lucky finds. What about the unlucky ones? The texts that remained in their archives when the water table rose, or the roof collapsed, or the fire consumed everything combustible. It is said that we know almost nothing about Babylon's artists. We don't know who designed the Ishtar Gate, that magnificent structure of glazed brick and mythological symbolism. We don't know the names of the craftsmen who mixed the pigments, who perfected the glaze formulas, who shaped the dragons and bulls with such precision that we can still see the texture of scales and the curve of horns after 4,000 years. We don't know what happened to Nebuchadnezzar's children. He had sons. Certainly one succeeded him briefly. But daughters? Other heirs? The royal succession is documented in fragments, in pieces, in glimpses that raise as many questions as they answer. Did his children walk the palace corridors we've excavated? Did they play in courtyards we haven't yet found? Are their names written on tablets still buried, waiting? Where exactly did the Tower of Babel stand? Etemenanke, the great ziggurat, is the most likely candidate, but its foundations have been excavated and mapped, and scholars still debate, still argue over texts and measurements, over biblical descriptions and archaeological evidence that never quite align perfectly. Perhaps the answer is buried deeper. Perhaps it's in a text we haven't found. Perhaps it's knowable. Or perhaps it will remain forever in the realm of almost certain, never proven, suspended between history and legend. Did the Hanging Gardens exist at all? The question has occupied scholars for generations. Ancient writers describe them. Archaeological excavation has found no definitive trace. Some now suggest they were in Nineveh, not Babylon. Others maintain they were in Babylon but haven't been found yet. Still others conclude they were purely legendary, a beautiful fiction, a dream of paradise that never had physical form. The debate continues because the evidence is incomplete, because the city is mostly unexcavated, because certainty eludes us. Beneath the silence of scholarly consensus, there is something else: a recognition that the historical record is fragmentary by nature, that the past comes to us in pieces, that what we know is always dwarfed by what we cannot know. Primary sources contradict each other. Herodotus says one thing about Babylon's walls. Ctesias says another. Biblical texts describe the city in terms shaped by theology. Babylonian inscriptions present royal propaganda. Each source has its own agenda, its own limitations, its own angle of vision. Truth, if we can even use that singular word, exists somewhere in the space between sources, in the careful triangulation of different perspectives, in the humble acknowledgement that certainty is often impossible. Archaeological evidence raises more questions than answers. A foundation is discovered. Was this a house or a workshop? A temple or an administrative building? Without inscriptions, without context, stone is just stone. Clay is just clay. The physical remains are mute without the texts to interpret them, and the texts are abstract without the physical remains to ground them. In this uncertainty, we find strange freedom. The freedom to wonder, to imagine, to sit with mystery as a valid response, as perhaps the only honest response to questions that may have no definitive answers. The freedom to say, I do and know, and let that unknowing be a space of possibility rather than a void of failure. Whispers tell us that perhaps some questions aren't meant to be answered, not because the answers are forbidden or dangerous, but because the questioning itself is valuable, because living with mystery is a practice worth cultivating, because certainty can be a kind of closing while uncertainty keeps us open, attentive, engaged. Perhaps some secrets aren't meant to be discovered. Not all of them we should dig, should excavate, should pursue knowledge with rigor and passion. But perhaps some portions of the past should remain veiled, should keep their silence, should exist as invitation rather than possession. The broken brick, the incomplete tablet, the empty space where a wall once stood. Are these losses? Yes, but they are also gifts. They are invitations to participation. When the record is complete, we can only receive. When the record is fragmentary, we must engage, must use imagination informed by knowledge, must fill gaps with possibilities, must become co-creators of meaning rather than passive consumers of fact. They invite creative engagement with the past. History is not just what happened, but also how we understand what happened, how we narrate it, how we connect it to our own lives and times. The gaps in the record are spaces where we can enter, where our questions can meet ancient questions, where dialogue becomes possible across the gulf of centuries, where memory fades, mystery deepens. And perhaps mystery is not the enemy of knowledge but its companion, the shadow that gives light its contours, the silence that makes speech meaningful. We close our journey here, in this unknowing, this sacred darkness where all stories begin and end. Not in despair, but in acceptance. Not in ignorance, but in recognition that knowledge has limits, that the past is not fully recoverable, that we see through a glass darkly, and must make peace with partial vision. Babylon was real. Let us affirm this without reservation. Real bricks were fired in real kilns. Real people walked real streets. Real children played in real courtyards. Real priests chanted real prayers in real temples. Real scribes pressed real style into real clay, creating real tablets that documented real events, real transactions, real thoughts, and real dreams. People lived there, loved there, woke each morning to the same sun that rises now, worried about harvests and health, about children and debts, about the future and the past. They were as human as we are, as complex, as contradictory, as capable of beauty and cruelty, creation and destruction, wisdom and folly. They built monuments to their gods and to themselves, trying like all humans to create something that would outlast mortality, to leave a mark, to be remembered, to matter beyond the brief span of years allotted to each life. But Babylon is also symbol, metaphor, warning, dream. It exists in the realm between history and myth, in that borderland where evidence and imagination meet and merge. It is the city of confused languages and scattered peoples. It is the golden head of the statue that will give way to baser metals. It is the whore drunk on blood. It is the wonder of the ancient world. It is exile and empire, creation and destruction, the height of human achievement and the depth of human arrogance. It is, simultaneously, the brick in our hand and the city in our mind, the physical ruin we can touch and the imaginative reconstruction we create from fragments. Both are real. Both are Babylon. And the tension between them, between what we can prove and what we can envision, is perhaps where Babylon most truly lives. Marked by mystery, veiled in uncertainty, Babylon remains perpetually just beyond our complete understanding. We can approach it. We can study it. We can excavate one more structure, translate one more tablet, refine one more theory. But we can never possess it entirely, never know it completely, never close the final gap between what was and what we can recover of what was. In the deepest night of our telling, as sleep approaches, as consciousness begins its nightly dissolution into dream, we let Babylon rest in this liminal space, neither fully known nor completely forgotten, neither entirely history or entirely myth, but held gently, carefully in the soft space where memory and mystery become one. Perhaps this is where it belongs. Perhaps this is its natural habitat, not the clean certainty of textbook summaries, but the shadowed complexity of partial knowledge and persistent wonder. Perhaps we honor Babylon most truly not by claiming to understand it completely, but by acknowledging how much remains unknown, how much will always remain unknown, how the city's greatest gift might be its refusal to be fully grasped. The sand still covers most of it. The silence still holds most of its secrets. The broken bricks still wait beneath our feet, patient as time itself, holding their stories close. And we, standing at the edge of what we know, looking into the vast darkness of what we don't know, feel not frustration, but something like reverence. The past is not a puzzle to be solved, but a presence to be with. History is not a corpse to be dissected, but a conversation that continues across centuries, a dialogue that requires our participation, our imagination, our willingness to dwell in questions that have no simple answers. Somewhere beneath the sand, Babylon dreams. And in our wondering about it, in our reaching toward it, in our acceptance that some mysteries remain mysteries, we become part of that dream, inheritors of a city that refuses to die completely, that persists in fragments and whispers, and the human need to remember, to know, to connect across time with those who came before. The mystery is written in broken brick, and the breaking itself is part of the message that all human works are fragmentary, that perfection is impossible, that we build and lose and remember and forget, and somehow, in that cycle, something essential is preserved. Not the whole city, but enough. Just enough to keep us wondering, keep us questioning, keep us engaged with a past that will never fully reveal itself, but will also never entirely disappear. The darkness deepens, the silence holds, and Babylon, real and imagined, known and unknown, present and absent, rests in the space between, eternal in its incompleteness, speaking most eloquently through what it does not say.